Imagine the final seconds of your life's greatest gamble. Imagine knowing that everything you've sacrificed, every promise you've made, every shred of dignity you've fought to reclaim, comes down to this one moment. Now imagine 8,000 people watching, waiting for you to fail. That's where this story ends. But to understand how we got there, we need to go back 9 weeks, to a day when failure seemed like the only possible outcome. The dust of Buffalo, Wyoming had a particular quality in the summer of 1895. It wasn't just dirt. It was pulverized earth mixed with sage, with the powdered remnants of cattle drives, with the fine grit that blew down from the Bighorn Mountains and settled into every crevice of human existence. For Ethan Wade, 17 years old and perpetually coated in that dust, it was the taste of invisibility. It coated his throat, settled in his lungs, and reminded him with every breath that he was part of the landscape that people walked across without seeing. He stood in the narrow shade beside Morrison's General Store, a coil of fence wire balanced on his shoulder, waiting for old Mr. Patterson to finish haggling over the price of lamp oil. The June sun was a physical weight pressing down on the Powder River Basin, turning the air into something you had to push through rather than breathe. Sweat traced clean lines down Ethan's dust-covered face, mapping the contours of exhaustion that came from rising at 4 in the morning to mend fence lines before the heat became unbearable. But Ethan's eyes weren't on Mr. Patterson or the fence wire, or even on the list of supplies his mother had carefully written out in her precise seamstress hand. His eyes were fixed on the poster that had appeared overnight on the board outside the sheriff's office. Even from 40 feet away, he could read every word. He'd already memorized them. Powder River Rodeo. Annual Cutting Horse Competition. August 15, 1895. First prize, $300. Register by August 1st. $300. Ethan's hands tightened on the fence wire until the metal bit into his palms. $300 was what most men in Buffalo made in 6 months of hard labor. It was enough to buy a decent horse, repair a roof, feed a family through a long winter. For Ethan and his mother Ruth, living in a drafty cabin they rented for $8 a month from the Mercer Cattle Company, $300 might as well have been $3,000. It was a fortune. It was impossible. But more than the money, more than any practical consideration, that poster represented something Ethan wanted with an ache that lived in his chest like a second heartbeat. Respect. Recognition. A single afternoon when people looked at him and saw something other than the Wade boy whose father had died in a ranch accident 5 years ago, leaving nothing but debts and a widow who took in sewing to keep them fed. A moment when he could be more than the kid who mended other people's fences for $3 a week. He'd been around horses his whole life. Before his father died, they'd kept 2 steady geldings for ranch work. Ethan had learned to ride before he learned to read, had that natural sense of balance and timing that couldn't be taught. Even now, working odd jobs around the basin, he was the one ranchers called when they needed someone to gentle a skittish mare or work a green colt. He had a gift. Everyone said so. But a gift without opportunity was just another form of poverty. The fantasy played in his mind like a worn strip of film, smooth from repetition. He could see himself in the competition arena, feel the powerful bunch and release of muscle beneath him as a cutting horse worked, that incredible dance between human and animal where you stopped being 2 separate creatures and became one focused intention. The crowd watching not with pity or dismissal but with genuine appreciation. His mother in the stands, her work-worn hands finally still, allowed to be proud. The sound of an approaching carriage pulled Ethan from his reverie. It wasn't just any carriage. It was the carriage, the one everyone in Buffalo knew by sight. Black lacquered wood polished to a mirror shine, brass fittings that caught the sun like accusations, pulled by a matched pair of bay horses so perfectly groomed they looked like they'd been carved from mahogany. The Mercer carriage. The sound of its wheels on the hard, packed dirt of Main Street was like a proclamation, a reminder of exactly who owned what in this corner of Wyoming territory. The carriage stopped directly in front of the general store, and the sudden absence of wheel noise seemed to create a vacuum that pulled all other sound into it. The blacksmith's hammer went silent mid-strike. Two women who'd been talking outside the milliner's shop stopped mid-word. Even the flies that had been buzzing around the horse trough seemed to pause. This was how power announced itself, Ethan thought, not with noise, but with the ability to create silence. Clayton Mercer stepped down from the carriage with the careful dignity of a man who'd spent 54 years cultivating an image of unshakable authority. He was tall, wide in the shoulders the way men who'd built empires with their own hands in their youth often were, but running to thickness now in middle age. His suit was Eastern tailored, his boots custom made in Cheyenne, and his face had the weathered hardness of Wyoming granite. But it was his eyes that people noticed, pale blue and cold, the kind of eyes that looked at the world and saw only assets and liabilities, inventory to be counted. Those eyes swept the street and landed on Ethan. For just a moment, something flickered across Clayton Mercer's face. Not quite recognition, more like a predator spotting movement in the brush, the instinctive calculation of whether something was worth pursuing. Then his mouth curved into a smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "Ethan Wade," Clayton's voice carried, pitched perfectly to reach every ear on the street. "This wasn't a private conversation. This was a performance. I hear you've been entertaining some ambitious thoughts." Ethan's stomach dropped. The fence wire suddenly felt like it weighed 100 pounds. He wanted to disappear, to become one with the dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun. "Don't look up," a voice in his head screamed. "Don't give him the satisfaction, be small, be invisible, be nothing." But it was too late. The audience was already gathering. Mr. Patterson had stepped out of the general store. The two women by the milliner's had moved closer. A group of ranch hands who'd been watering their horses were drifting over, sensing entertainment. This was what passed for spectacle in a town of 800 people. Clayton Mercer didn't just do business. He created theater. "Just dreams, Mr. Mercer," Ethan managed, his voice coming out smaller than he'd intended. He fixed his eyes on the toes of his worn-out boots, boots that had been his father's once, now held together with wire and determination. Nothing more than that. "Dreams," Clayton repeated as if tasting the word. "This town was built on dreams, boy. Dreams of gold, dreams of cattle, dreams of making something from nothing." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "Of course, some dreams are more realistic than others. I understand you've been eyeing that rodeo poster, thinking about the cutting horse competition." Heat flooded Ethan's face, a prickling shame that started at his collar and climbed to his hairline. How did Clayton know? Had someone overheard him mention it to his mother? Had the store clerk gossiped about the way Ethan had stood staring at that poster for 10 minutes yesterday? In a small town, privacy was a luxury, and poor people had no luxuries at all. "A man can't very well compete in a cutting horse competition without a horse," Clayton continued, his voice taking on a tone of exaggerated sympathy that was worse than outright mockery. "And I'm a generous man. Isn't that right, Henderson?" His foreman, a lean man named Jack Henderson who wore cruelty the way other men wore hats, stepped forward from beside the carriage. "Very generous, Mr. Mercer." Clayton snapped his fingers, the sound sharp as a gunshot in the quiet street. "Bring it out." What Henderson led from behind the carriage wasn't a horse. It was the memory of one, the ghost of what a horse might have been before suffering and neglect had stripped away everything but the barest framework of survival. The animal that stumbled into view was a chestnut gelding, or had been once. Now its coat was a dull, patchy landscape of matted hair and visible ribs. Each rib stood out in sharp relief, a xylophone of bone you could have played a tune on. Its hip jutted at an unnatural angle on the left side, and it favored its left front leg with a limp so pronounced that every step looked like agony. But it was the horse's head that broke something in Ethan's chest. It hung low, nearly dragging, the posture of complete defeat. One eye was clouded over, milky white with either injury or infection. The other eye, still brown and clear, held an emptiness that was worse than pain. This was an animal that had given up. This was what happened when hope died. The smell hit Ethan from 10 feet away. Infection, decay, the sour, sweet stench of wounds left untreated, of a body consuming itself to stay alive. He could see the saddle sores on the horse's back, old injuries that had scarred over badly. Could see the swelling in that left foreleg, hot and angry even from a distance. A collective gasp rippled through the growing crowd, quickly smothered by the first nervous laughs. This wasn't just cruelty. This was artistry and humiliation. Clayton Mercer had found the most broken, most hopeless animal imaginable and was about to present it as a gift. The joke was so perfectly constructed that Ethan almost had to admire it even as it destroyed him. "A gift," Clayton announced, sweeping his arm toward the skeletal horse with the flourish of a magician revealing his greatest trick. "To help you follow your dreams, Ethan Wade. Every young man deserves a chance to prove himself." The laughter wasn't nervous anymore. It rolled through the crowd like thunder building on itself. Men slapped their thighs. Women hid smiles behind their hands. The ranch hands were nearly doubled over, one of them laughing so hard he had to lean against the horse trough for support. The sound was a physical thing, sharp and bright as broken glass, and Ethan felt it flaying him open, stripping away skin and muscle until there was nothing left but exposed nerve. This is it, Ethan thought, his stomach clenching so hard he thought he might vomit right there in the street. This is the worst moment of my life. This is what it feels like to be completely destroyed in front of everyone you know. Henderson shoved the frayed rope lead into Ethan's hand. The hemp was rough, stained dark with old sweat and blood. The horse stumbled as the rope changed hands, its bad leg nearly buckling completely. It let out a sound, a wheezing sigh that might have been pain or might have been resignation, and the sound of it was worse than any scream. Ethan stood there, rope in hand, every muscle in his body screaming at him to drop it and run, to refuse this poisoned gift and salvage whatever microscopic scrap of dignity might remain. But refusing would mean being branded a coward, ungrateful for Mr. Mercer's generous charity. Accepting meant becoming the living embodiment of the town's favorite joke. It was a perfect trap. There was no way out that didn't end in shame. He forced himself to look at the horse, really look at it, past the jutting ribs and the clouded eye and the smell of decay. The animal was defeated, starved, dying by inches. But as Ethan met that one clear brown eye, he saw something that stopped his breath. It wasn't just misery. Deep in that brown iris, buried beneath layers of neglect and suffering, there was a spark. Small as a pinprick, fierce as a struck match, it was defiance. Pure, stubborn, inexplicable refusal to die. This horse should have given up weeks ago, months ago, should have laid down and let death take it, but it was still standing, still breathing, still here. Ethan recognized that spark. He saw it in his own reflection every morning when he washed his face in the basin, in the seconds before he put on the mask of invisibility he wore to survive each day. The refusal to accept that this was all there was, all there would ever be. The stubborn insistence that somehow, somewhere, there had to be more. In that moment, looking into the eye of this broken animal, Ethan made a choice. Not a smart choice, not a practical choice, but the only choice he could make and still be able to look at himself afterward. The shame boiling in his gut cooled into something harder, something like resolve, or maybe just recklessness, or maybe the thing that happened when a person had absolutely nothing left to lose. He lifted his chin, ignored the jeering faces, the pointing fingers, the laughter that seemed to have no end, looked directly at Clayton Mercer with something that might have been the beginning of defiance. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise. "Thank you, Mr. Mercer. He's a fine animal." The laughter faltered, confused. This wasn't the script. Ethan was supposed to refuse or accept with obvious shame or break down crying. He wasn't supposed to stand straight and speak with calm dignity. "I'll call him Dust," Ethan continued, because the horse looked like it had been assembled from the same powder that coated everything in Buffalo, because naming something gave it reality, made it more than just a joke. "Come on, boy." He gave the rope a gentle tug, so light it was barely pressure at all, and started walking. The horse followed, that agonizing scuff drag step rhythm that would haunt Ethan's dreams. Scuff drag step, scuff drag step. Behind them, the laughter renewed, louder than before, following them like a physical blow all the way down Main Street. The walk to the cabin was a mile of quiet agony. Every time the horse put weight on that left foreleg, a tremor ran through its emaciated body. Ethan could feel the stares from every window, every doorway, could hear the whispers that would be tomorrow's gossip, could imagine his mother's face when he brought this walking corpse home. The afternoon sun beat down without mercy. Sweat soaked through Ethan's shirt, and he could only imagine how the heat was affecting the horse. He stopped 3 times to let the animal rest, and each time it took longer for it to start moving again. By the time they reached the cabin, Ethan's hands were shaking and his throat was so tight he could barely swallow. The cabin sat at the edge of Buffalo's town limits, where the street gave way to scrubland and the properties went from owned to rented. It was small, just 2 rooms, with a lean-to on the side that served as kitchen and washroom. The roof leaked in 3 places. The floor was packed dirt, but Ruth Wade kept it cleaner than most of the fancy houses in town, and there were always wildflowers in a jar on the table, and it smelled like the lavender soap she made from scratch. It was home. Ruth was outside when they arrived, kneeling beside a tin washtub, wringing out one of Mrs. Harrison's good linen sheets. Her hands, Ethan noticed for the 1000th time, were red and chapped from constant immersion in lye soap and hot water. The knuckles were swollen, early arthritis setting in from years of this work. She was 42 but looked older, worn thin by widowhood and poverty, and the endless grind of making $3 stretch to feed 2 people. She looked up at the sound of their approach, looked at Ethan, looked at the horse. Her hands stilled on the wet linen, water dripping unnoticed back into the tub. For a long moment she didn't speak. Her face didn't register anger or disappointment, just a profound, bone-deep weariness that hurt Ethan more than any yelling could have. "Oh, Ethan," she finally said, her voice rough from the dust she breathed in every day. The words carried the weight of 100 conversations they'd had before, about dreams and reality, about what they could afford and what they couldn't. "That man finds new ways to be cruel, doesn't he?" "Ma," Ethan started, but didn't know how to finish. How could he explain what he'd felt looking into that horse's eye? How could he make her understand that refusing would have felt like giving up on himself? Ruth stood, wiping her hands on her apron. She walked closer, studying the horse with the practical eye of someone who'd lived around animals her whole life. "We can't afford to feed ourselves properly, son, let alone this." "He just needs care, Ma," Ethan said, though even as he spoke the words he could hear how hollow they sounded. Care required resources. Resources required money. Money was exactly what they didn't have. He just needs a chance. His mother looked at him for a long moment and something in her face softened. She reached out and cupped his cheek with one work-worn hand. "You've got your father's heart," she said quietly. "He couldn't turn away from suffering either. Got him killed, trying to help that fool Morrison boy who didn't know how to break a horse proper." Ethan remembered. Remembered his father riding out to the Morrison place. Remembered the rider who'd come back hours later with the news. Remembered the funeral and the bills and the slow, grinding realization that they were alone and poor, and that was how they would stay. "Go on then," Ruth said, dropping her hand. "Get him settled. Use the lean to out back. There's some old hay in there, been there since your daddy's time. It's probably moldy, but it's all we have. And Ethan, use our drinking water for him, not the wash water. He deserves that much dignity." Ethan led the horse around to the back of the cabin, where a rickety leaned leaned against the wall at an angle that defied physics. It had been built to shelter firewood, not livestock, but it would have to do. He used a bucket to carry water from their barrel, precious water that his mother carried up from the creek twice a day. The horse drank with desperate, noisy gulps, and Ethan had to pull the bucket away before it made itself sick. He found an old horse blanket in a trunk that had belonged to his father, threadbare but clean, and draped it over the animal's sharp back. Then he just stood there, running his hand down the horse's neck, feeling the knots of scar tissue, the trembling of exhausted muscles. The horse leaned into his touch, just slightly, and that small gesture of trust nearly broke him. "What am I doing?" he whispered to the evening air. "You're dying, this is impossible." The horse's one good eye swiveled to look at him, and that spark was still there, still burning, still refusing to go out. Ethan was still standing there, lost in a haze of exhaustion and doubt, and something that might have been the beginning of hope, when a shadow fell across the lean-to opening. "That's a sorry sight, son." The voice was like wind across stone, low and weathered. Ethan spun around to find an old man standing there, silhouetted against the fading light. As he stepped forward, Ethan recognized him. Hank Dawson. Everyone in Buffalo knew Hank or knew of him. He lived in an abandoned line shack about 10 miles north of town, had for the past 3 years. Before that, he'd been somebody important, a horse trainer with a reputation that reached all the way to Cheyenne. Now he was just the crazy hermit who came into town once a month for supplies and spoke to no one. Hank Dawson was all angles and hard edges, a man in his early 70s who moved like someone 20 years younger despite the limp in his left leg. His face was a map of sun and wind and time, wrinkles cut deep as arroyos, eyes still sharp beneath white eyebrows. He smelled of leather and wood smoke and horse, the scent so familiar and comforting that Ethan felt something in his chest ease just slightly. "Mr. Dawson," Ethan managed, "I didn't hear you coming." "Most people don't," Hank said. He moved past Ethan without asking permission into the lean-to and stood looking at the horse. Really looking the way someone who knew horses looked, not at the surface but deeper, reading the story written in bone and muscle and the set of the animal's frame. For a full minute Hank didn't speak, he just studied. Then slowly he began to move. His hands, gnarled with age but still sure, ran down the horse's body, not patting, examining. He pressed fingers into the swollen foreleg, making the horse flinch, but Hank didn't stop. He lifted each hoof, checking the frogs, studying the wear patterns. He ran his hands along the spine, checking alignment. Gently but firmly, he forced the horse's mouth open, peering at the worn teeth. "Where," Hank asked, his voice flat and giving nothing away, "did you get this animal?" "A gift," Ethan said, the word tasting like ash, "from Clayton Mercer." Hank spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the ground. "That man is a fool." He stepped back, his eyes traveling over the horse one more time, lingering on details Ethan couldn't read. "A blind, arrogant fool." "Sorry." Hank turned to look at Ethan, and there was something in his eyes that might have been anger or might have been grief or might have been both. "He gave you this horse to humiliate you, didn't he? In front of the whole town." "Yes, sir." A sound came from Hank's chest, something between a laugh and a sigh. "Well, boy, the joke's on him." He reached out and ran a reverent hand down the horse's muzzle. The animal didn't flinch. didn't pull away, just stood there as if recognizing something familiar in this old man's touch. "This ain't no dust." Hank's fingers found something on the horse's right hip, hidden beneath the matted, filthy hair. He worked at it gently, brushing away dirt and debris until Ethan could see what he'd uncovered. A brand. Not the usual simple letters or shapes most ranchers used, but something more elaborate. 2 letters worked into a design, M and W, intertwined. "This here," Hank said, his voice dropping to something almost like reverence, "is Windchaser." The name landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through Ethan's understanding. Windchaser. Even he had heard the name in the way you heard about legends. A cutting horse that had won Cheyenne Frontier Days 5 years running. An animal so talented, so perfectly trained, that people traveled from 3 states over just to watch it work. A champion. "That's impossible," Ethan breathed. "Windchaser was magnificent, this horse is." "What's left," Hank finished, his voice hardening. "This is what's left after 2 years of deliberate starvation and neglect." He pointed to the brand. "M.W. Mercer Windchaser, belonged to Catherine Mercer, Clayton's wife. I trained this horse from a yearling, watched him grow into the finest cutting horse I ever had the privilege to work with, and I watched her ride him. She was the only one who could really ride him, you understand. He didn't just work for her, he danced." Hank's voice cracked slightly on that last word, and he cleared his throat roughly. "Catherine died 2 years ago come September. Riding accident. Windchaser spooked at something, a rattlesnake some said, through her. She hit her head on a fence post, died before the doctor could even get there." Ethan felt something cold settle in his stomach. "And Clayton." "Clayton Mercer fell apart," Hank said flatly. "Or maybe he just showed what he really was underneath all that polish. He couldn't look at this horse without seeing his wife falling. So he made the horse disappear. Everyone thought he'd sold him, sent him off to some ranch in Colorado or Montana. But he didn't sell him. He just locked him in a back pasture with no shelter and barely enough food and water to keep him alive, and let time do the rest." The old man's hand shook slightly as he stroked the horse's neck. "I tried to help. Went to Clayton, told him I'd take the horse, train him for someone else, anything. He fired me on the spot. Told every rancher in Wyoming that I was a thief, that I couldn't be trusted. Destroyed my reputation in a single afternoon." Hank's eyes glittered with something that might have been tears or might have been rage. "I'm 71 years old, boy. I've worked with horses my whole life. And Clayton Mercer erased all of it because I tried to save the animal his wife loved." Ethan stared at the horse with new eyes. This wasn't just a broken animal. This was a champion who'd been deliberately destroyed. This was grief turned into weapon, aimed at the most innocent target imaginable. "Can he," Ethan started, almost afraid to finish the question, "can he be fixed?" Hank was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "He's half-starved. His left foreleg has an old tendon injury that healed wrong, probably tore it in the pasture and no one treated it. His right hip is out of alignment, likely from compensating for the bad leg. He's got saddle sores that have infected. One eye is clouded, might be permanent. His spirit is guttered down to almost nothing." He paused. "It would take a miracle." Then Hank turned and looked at Ethan directly, studying him the way he'd studied the horse. "But he's got the blood still. You can see it in the way he holds himself, even broken down as he is. And he's got something else." Hank tapped his own chest. "He's got that look in his eye, the one that says he's not done yet. Question is, boy, do you have the grit to try?" Before Ethan could answer, a sound came from the darkness beyond the lean-to. A footstep on gravel, light and hesitant. Both Ethan and Hank turned as a figure emerged from the shadows, small and uncertain in the growing dusk. It was a young woman, and as she stepped into the weak light spilling from the cabin's window, Ethan's breath caught. Grace Mercer. Clayton Mercer's daughter. She was 19, tall and slender, with her mother's delicate features and her father's determined jaw. Her dress was fine quality but plain, and she held a wrapped bundle clutched to her chest like a shield. "I saw what my father did," she said, her voice trembling. She wouldn't meet Ethan's eyes, looking instead at the horse with an expression of heartbreaking sadness. "In town today. I saw it and it was monstrous. I couldn't just." "Miss Grace," Hank said softly. There was something in his voice, a gentleness that hadn't been there before. "You shouldn't be here." "I know," she whispered. "I know what people will say. I know what my father will do if he finds out, but I had to come." She stepped forward past Ethan and held out the bundle to Hank. Her hands were shaking. "This is all I could take from the stable without being noticed. Medicine, liniment, grain. The good grain from the stores my father keeps for his show horses." Hank took the bundle, opened it. Inside were small bottles and tins, carefully wrapped. Carbolic acid for cleaning wounds, laudanum for pain, a poultice mixture for drawing out infection, and beneath that, several pounds of high-quality oats, the kind that cost more per pound than most people in Buffalo made in a day. "Miss Grace," Hank said again, and now his voice was thick, "your mother would be proud of you." At the mention of her mother, Grace's composure cracked. Tears spilled down her cheeks and she finally looked at the horse. "He was my mother's horse," she said. "She loved him more than anything, more than the house, more than her jewelry, more than all the fine things my father could buy her. She'd spend hours with him, riding or just grooming him, talking to him like he could understand. And he could, I think. He understood her in ways that my father never did." She wiped at her tears with the back of her hand. "After she died, my father couldn't stand the sight of him. I hoped he'd sold him to someone who would care for him. I didn't know he was doing this. I didn't know until today when I saw him in town, and I realized what my father had become." Grace turned to Ethan for the first time, and he was struck by the desperation in her eyes. "Please," she said, "I know what you must think of my family, of me, but I couldn't let him die like this. Not him. He deserves better than this. He deserves to be remembered for what he was, for what he meant to her." In that moment, standing in the fading light of a Wyoming evening, a silent alliance was formed. Three people bound together by a shared understanding that what had happened to this horse was wrong. That sometimes the only way to honor the dead was to save what they loved. That healing one broken thing might be the only way to heal themselves. Ethan looked at Hank, at Grace, at the skeletal horse that had once been a champion, felt the weight of impossibility pressing down on his shoulders. 9 weeks until the rodeo. 9 weeks to transform this dying animal into something that could compete. It was insane. It was hopeless. "I'm in," Ethan said. "Whatever it takes, I'm in." Hank nodded slowly, a grim smile crossing his weathered face. "Then we start tomorrow before first light. And boy, I'm going to tell you right now, this is going to be the hardest thing you've ever done. There will be days you want to quit, days you think it's impossible, days when the whole town is laughing at you and you wonder why you didn't just walk away from Mercer's gift." "I know," Ethan said. "No," Hank corrected. "You don't, not yet, but you will." He looked at the horse and something in his expression softened. "We're not just trying to win a rodeo, son. We're trying to bring a champion back from the dead. And that takes more than skill or knowledge. It takes belief. Can you believe in something impossible?" Ethan reached out and rested his hand on the horse's neck. Felt the 2 prominent bones, the trembling muscles, the warmth of life that refused to surrender. That spark in the horse's eye met his own, and in that moment, Ethan understood what Hank was really asking. Could he believe that broken things could be made whole? That the lost could be found? That a poor kid from Buffalo, Wyoming, could stand in an arena and prove that he was more than invisible, more than a joke, more than the sum of his poverty and his losses? "Yes," Ethan said quietly, I can believe. Outside the lean-to, the Wyoming night was settling in, vast and star-scattered and indifferent to human suffering. But inside that small shelter, something had changed. 3 people and 1 broken horse, united by nothing more than stubborn hope and the refusal to accept that this was how the story had to end. Tomorrow the work would begin. Tomorrow they would start the impossible task of resurrection. But tonight, for just this moment, belief was enough. The last light faded from the sky, and in the darkness, Windchaser let out a soft breath that might have been exhaustion or might have been the first, tentative sound of hope returning. Dawn came to the Powder River Basin the way it always did, not as a gentle awakening but as an invasion. The sun didn't rise so much as it attacked the horizon, turning the sky from black to blood red to harsh white gold in the space of minutes. By the time the first rays touched the peaks of the Bighorn Mountains, the air was already warm, already holding the promise of another scorching August day. Ethan had been awake for hours. He'd barely slept, his mind spinning through everything Hank had told him, everything that lay ahead. Every time he'd started to drift off, he'd see that spark in Windchaser's eye, that stubborn refusal to die, and guilt would jolt him awake again. The horse was suffering out there in the lean-to, and Ethan was lying in bed. He'd finally given up on sleep around 3 in the morning, dressed quietly in the darkness, and slipped out of the cabin without waking his mother. The lean-to was 15 feet from the back door, and in the pre-dawn stillness he could hear the horse breathing. Ragged, labored breaths that caught and rattled in damaged lungs, but breathing, still alive, still fighting. "Morning, boy," Ethan whispered as he approached. The horse's one good eye opened, tracking his movement. No whinny of greeting, no sign of welcome, just wary acknowledgement that another day had begun and with it, another stretch of survival. Ethan had brought a bucket of water from the barrel, and he held it steady while Windchaser drank. The horse was careful this time, not gulping desperately the way he had yesterday. Learning already that water would come regularly now, that he didn't have to drain every drop in case it was the last. "Ethan Wade." The voice came from the shadows beyond the lean-to, and Ethan turned to find Hank Dawson emerging from the scrubland. The old man moved like smoke, silent despite his limp, and Ethan wondered how long he'd been standing there watching. "Mr. Dawson, I didn't expect you this early." Didn't expect or didn't hope. Hank's weathered face was unreadable in the half-light. "Boy, if we're going to do this, we do it right. And doing it right means starting before the sun's up and finishing after it's down, every single day. No exceptions. You understand what you've signed up for." Ethan nodded, though he suspected he didn't understand at all. Not yet. Not really. Hank stepped into the lean-to and began his examination of Windchaser, the same methodical assessment he'd done the night before. His hands moved with the certainty of someone who'd performed this ritual 10,000 times. Press here, feel for heat. Lift the hoof, check for cracks. Run fingers along the spine, searching for misalignment. "First thing you need to understand," Hank said as he worked, "is that we're not fixing a horse. We're healing one. There's a difference. Fixing is mechanical. You replace what's broken. But healing, that's organic. That's coaxing the body to remember what it was meant to be." He pressed his thumb into the swollen tendon of Windchaser's left foreleg, and the horse flinched. "This leg, the injury's old. Tendon tore probably 6 months ago, maybe more. With no treatment, it tried to heal itself, but it healed wrong. Scar tissue built up crooked, like a tree growing around a wire fence." "Can it be fixed?" Ethan asked. "Healed," Hank corrected, "and maybe, if we're patient, if we're smart, if we're lucky." He straightened, his own knees cracking with the movement. "But here's what I'm telling you right now, and you better believe it. We don't start with that leg, we start with the horse." Ethan frowned. "I don't understand." "His body's broken, sure, But his spirit's what's really damaged. You can see it in the way he stands, the way he holds his head. He expects pain, expects cruelty, expects that every human hand is going to hurt him. Until we fix that, until we teach him that kindness exists again, nothing else we do will matter. Hank reached into his coat and pulled out a small cloth bag. From it, he produced a handful of oats. Not the cheap, dusty grain most horses got, but premium stock, each kernel plump and golden. He held his palm flat and offered it to Windchaser. The horse stared at the oats for a long moment. You could see the war playing out behind that brown eye. Hunger versus suspicion. Need versus self-preservation. Finally, moving with painful slowness, Windchaser extended his neck and lipped the oats from Hank's palm. Chewed carefully, as if even this small pleasure might be snatched away. "Good," Hank murmured. "That's good, old son. Nobody's going to hurt you anymore. Those days are over." As the sun broke fully over the horizon, painting the scrubland in shades of copper and gold, Hank laid out the plan. They couldn't work here, he explained. Too visible, too close to town. Word would spread and Clayton Mercer would find ways to interfere. They needed somewhere private, somewhere they could work without eyes watching, without gossip spreading. "I know a place," Hank said. 12 miles north up in the breaks. Hidden valley with a year-round creek. Been living there since Mercer ran me out of the business. Got shelter, got water, got everything we need." 12 miles, Ethan repeated. "Can he even walk that far?" "Not today, but we're not moving him today. Today we just start teaching him to trust again. The rest comes after." What followed was the strangest day of Ethan's life. Hank didn't train. He didn't instruct. He simply existed alongside the horse, moving slowly and deliberately, speaking in a low, continuous murmur that seemed designed more to create sound than convey meaning. He groomed Windchaser with a brush so soft it barely touched the skin, working for hours to remove the matted tangles of hair and dirt. Each stroke was gentle, careful, accompanied by that steady stream of words. "That's right, old friend. We're going to make you beautiful again. Going to make you feel like the champion you are. Catherine would want that. She'd want you cared for proper." Ethan watched, learning. This wasn't about the physical act of grooming. This was about touch without pain, about human presence without threat, about rebuilding trust one gentle stroke at a time. "Your turn," Hank said after an hour, handing Ethan the brush. "Slow and easy, talk to him. Doesn't matter what you say. He needs to learn your voice, learn that you're safe." Ethan took the brush, his hand trembling slightly. Up close, the extent of Windchaser's damage was even more apparent. The saddle sores on his back were deep, some of them infected, weeping clear fluid. His ribs weren't just visible but prominent, sharp enough to cut your hand on. The smell of sickness clung to him, sweet and sour and wrong. But Ethan started brushing, working around the worst of the sores, and he started talking. At first, the words felt foolish, self-conscious, but gradually they began to flow. "I don't know if we can do this, boy. I don't know if 9 weeks is enough time, or if I'm strong enough, or if any of this makes sense. But I know what it feels like to be invisible, to have everyone look through you like you're not even there. And I know what it feels like when someone finally sees you, when someone finally says, 'You matter, you're worth saving,' so that's what I'm saying to you. You matter, and we're going to prove it." The horse's ear swiveled back, listening. And for just a moment, Ethan felt that connection Hank had talked about. That sense of two beings understanding each other across the gulf of species. They worked until the sun was high and brutal, and then Hank called a halt. "He's exhausted. We pushed enough for today. Tomorrow we move him. But tonight he needs to rest and know he's safe." "What about food?" Ethan asked. "Real food, not just grain." "Miss Grace will bring what she can, but here's the truth, boy. We can't just start feeding him heavy. His stomach's shrunk from starvation. Too much food too fast will kill him sure as neglect did. We build him back slow, gentle. Let his body remember how to process nutrition. As if summoned by her name, Grace Mercer appeared in the early afternoon, riding a small mare and leading a pack horse laden with supplies. She looked nervous, her eyes darting around as if expecting her father to materialize from the sagebrush. But she'd brought what she'd promised: more grain, tins of molasses to mix with it, making it easier to digest, clean blankets, and most precious of all, small bottles of medicine that cost more than Ethan made in a month. "I can't stay," she said, handing the supplies to Hank with shaking hands. "He's been watching me. He doesn't know what I'm doing, but he suspects something. I'll come back when I can, but it might be a few days." "Miss Grace," Hank said gently, "you don't have to do this. The risk you're taking if your father finds out." "He already took everything that mattered to me," Grace said, and there was steel beneath the trembling. "He took my mother. He took the one creature she loved most in the world and tried to destroy it. If he finds out I'm helping, what more can he do? Disown me. I've been a ghost in that house for 2 years. At least this way, I'm a ghost with purpose." She looked at Windchaser and her expression softened. "My mother used to say that horses were honest in a way people never could be. They couldn't lie, couldn't pretend. If they loved you, you knew. If they trusted you, you knew. She said Windchaser was the most honest creature she'd ever met." Grace's voice cracked. "I want him to be honest again, to remember what it feels like to be loved instead of punished for existing." Then she was gone, riding back toward town and the big house on the hill where her father waited, suspicious and cold. That night Ethan slept in the lean-to. Not inside, which was too small, but curled up just outside the opening with an old blanket. His mother had protested, worried about snakes and the cold that came to Wyoming even in August once the sun went down. But Ethan insisted. If Windchaser was going to learn to trust, he needed to know that humans could be constant, could be present, could stay. Somewhere in the deep watches of the night, Ethan woke to a sound. Soft, barely audible. He opened his eyes to find Windchaser's head extended through the lean-to opening, the horse's nose just inches from Ethan's face. In the starlight, that one good eye gleamed, studying him. "Can't sleep either," Ethan whispered. The horse didn't pull back, didn't flinch. Just breathed, warm breath washing over Ethan's face, smelling of oats and hay and something animal and alive. And slowly, carefully, Ethan reached up and rested his hand on the horse's muzzle. Felt the velvet softness of the skin, the warmth, the slight tremor that might have been fear or might have been something else. They stayed like that for a long time, boy and horse, connected in the darkness. And when Ethan finally drifted back to sleep, Windchaser's head was still there, a silent guardian keeping watch. The move to Hank's hidden valley happened 3 days later, in the coolest part of the pre-dawn morning. Windchaser was stronger, marginally, from 3 days of gentle care and regular feeding. Strong enough to make the 12-mile walk, Hank judged, if they took it slow and stopped frequently. The journey took 6 hours. 6 hours of that agonizing scuff drag step rhythm, of stops every quarter mile to let the horse rest and drink. The landscape shifted around them as they traveled north, the open basin giving way to broken country, ridges and gullies carved by ancient water. And finally, through a narrow cut between 2 rock faces that you'd miss if you didn't know to look for it, into a hidden valley that seemed to belong to another world. It was perhaps 2 acres of sheltered grassland, a creek running through the center, cottonwood trees providing shade. The rock walls rose on 3 sides, protection from wind and prying eyes. At the far end, built into an overhang, was a small cabin, rough but solid, Hank's home for the past 3 years. "Welcome to the only place in Wyoming that Clayton Mercer doesn't own," Hank said with grim satisfaction. They settled Windchaser in a natural shelter formed by an overhanging rock face, much larger and more protected than the lean-to had been. Fresh grass grew thick here, and the horse began to graze immediately. That simple act of eating suddenly transformed into something joyful by the abundance around him. And so the real work began. Hank's training philosophy was simple in theory, brutal in execution. Heal the body, heal the mind, build strength, build trust, and only then, only when the foundation was solid, begin to ask for performance. The days fell into a rhythm that Ethan felt in his bones, in his muscles, in the exhaustion that pulled him down into dreamless sleep each night. He would rise at 4, ride the 6 miles from Buffalo to the valley on a borrowed horse, arriving as the first light touched the rock walls. There would be feeding first, mixing the grain with molasses and warm water to make it easier to digest. Then grooming, an hour of gentle brushing that served double duty of cleaning and bonding. Then exercise. The creek became their therapy pool. Hank had learned this technique from cavalry trainers years ago. Water-supported weight took pressure off damaged joints and tendons, let muscles work without the strain of carrying body mass. Every morning, Ethan would lead Windchaser into the creek, into water that came up to the horse's knees, and they would walk, back and forth, upstream and down for an hour, sometimes 2. The cold water reduced inflammation. The resistance built strength. And the repetitive motion taught Windchaser's body to move correctly again, to step without the hitch that had become habitual. The body remembers, Hank would say, watching from the bank. Right now, his body remembers pain. Every step he expects that foreleg to hurt, so he's learned to compensate. But if we can create new memories, pain-free memories, we can teach him a different way. It was grueling work. Ethan's own legs would ache from walking in creek current. His back would scream from the constant bending and lifting involved in caring for the horse. His hands developed blisters from the grooming brushes, and the blisters turned to calluses. But he showed up every morning, every single one. In the afternoons, after the creek work, would come what Hank called the rebuilding. This was massage, deep tissue work on the damaged foreleg, working the liniment that Grace had provided into the knotted tendons. Ethan learned to read the horse's body, to feel the difference between good pain, the kind that came from healing, and bad pain, the kind that meant stop now. He learned to apply heat with cloths soaked in the hot spring water that bubbled up at the valley's north end. Learned to wrap the leg with precise tension, enough to support but not to constrict. And through it all there was talking, constant, gentle talking, about the weather, about the mountains, about nothing and everything, the sound of a human voice that meant safety instead of threat. Grace came when she could, usually in the dead of night, slipping away from her father's house with whatever supplies she could smuggle. Medicine, grain. Once, miraculously, a veterinary manual she'd mail ordered from Cheyenne, filled with diagrams and treatment protocols. She would stay for an hour, maybe 2, helping with the evening care, speaking softly to Windchaser in a voice that sounded heartbreakingly like Hank's descriptions of her mother. "I remember watching Mother with him," Grace said one night as she brushed the horse's mane. "She would spend hours just talking to him. My father used to get so angry, said she loved the horse more than her own family. But that wasn't it. It was just that Windchaser never judged her, never expected her to be anything other than herself. In that house, with my father, she always had to be perfect. But with this horse, she could just be." Ruth came too once she understood what her son was attempting. She brought food, practical food that would keep Ethan's strength up through the long days. Bread she'd baked before dawn, dried meat. Once, a jar of honey that must have cost her a week's wages. She didn't say much, but her presence said everything. "I believe in you. I'm with you. We'll see this through together." But it was Hank who was the constant presence, the North Star around which all this effort revolved. He was there every morning when Ethan arrived, had usually been there for hours already, preparing feed, checking Windchaser, planning the day's work. And he was there every evening when Ethan finally had to leave to ride back to Buffalo before full dark. The old man seemed to need almost no sleep, driven by something deeper than mere dedication. One evening, 3 weeks into the training, Ethan found Hank sitting on a rock beside the creek, a bottle of whiskey in his hand. This was unusual. Hank was abstemious by nature, rarely touching alcohol. But tonight, the bottle was a quarter empty, and the old man's eyes had the distant look of someone staring at ghosts. "Mr. Dawson, you all right?" Hank didn't answer immediately. He took another pull from the bottle, then spoke to the darkening sky rather than to Ethan. "I need to tell you something, boy. Something I should have told you from the start, but I was too much of a coward." Ethan sat down on the rock beside him, waiting. "I wasn't just Catherine Mercer's horse trainer," Hank said finally. His voice was rough, scraped raw by whiskey and emotion. "I loved her, had loved her for 15 years. Since she was a girl of 12 and I was training horses for her father, watched her grow up, watched her become beautiful and kind and everything good in this world, and somewhere along the way I fell." He laughed, a bitter sound. "She never knew. How could I tell her? I was 20 years older, a hired hand, nobody special. When she married Clayton Mercer, I told myself it was fine, that I could be happy just being near her, training her horses, seeing her smile. That was enough." Hank's hands tightened on the bottle. "The day she died, that morning, she came to the stable early before the household was awake, asked me if she should ride. Said Windchaser seemed tense, not quite himself. Asked me honest, should she ride today or wait?" "What did you say?" Ethan asked quietly. "I said ride. I said he was fine, probably just feeling fresh from being stalled, but that wasn't why I said it." Hank's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I said it because I wanted to watch her ride. It was my favorite thing in the world, watching Catherine on that horse. The way she moved with him, the way she laughed when he did something clever. I was selfish. I wanted that moment of joy even though my gut was telling me something was off." A tear tracked down Hank's weathered cheek. 2 hours later she was dead, and I killed her, not with my hands but with my selfishness. If I'd told her to wait, if I'd listened to that warning in my gut instead of my heart, she'd still be alive. "Mr. Dawson," Ethan started, but Hank cut him off. "Clayton knew. After she died, he looked at me and he said, 'You loved her, didn't you?' And I couldn't lie. I nodded, and he said, 'You killed her with your selfishness. Get out of my sight and never come back.' The blacklisting wasn't just business. It was punishment, and God help me, I deserved it." Hank turned to look at Ethan, his eyes red and raw. "That's why I'm here. That's why I'm doing this. I can't bring Catherine back. Can't undo what my selfishness caused. But this horse, saving him, that's the only apology I have left to give her. The only way I can say I'm sorry." Ethan sat in silence for a long moment, processing this confession. Then he spoke, choosing his words carefully. "My father died saving someone else, trying to help a neighbor who was in over his head with a dangerous horse. Got kicked in the chest, died before the doctor arrived. For years I was angry about that. Angry that he threw his life away for someone who didn't even thank us after, who never helped my mother when we were struggling. I thought it was waste. Stupid, pointless waste." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But my mother told me something. She said guilt doesn't honor the dead. Giving up doesn't honor them. The only way to honor someone is to live in a way that would make them proud, to take the love they gave you and pass it forward." Ethan looked at Hank directly. "You loved Catherine Mercer. That love made you want to see her happy, want to see her ride. Was it selfish? Maybe. But it was also human. And punishing yourself for being human doesn't bring her back. It just means 2 lives were lost that day instead of 1. "Boy, you don't understand." "I understand that you're here," Ethan interrupted gently. "I understand that you're using everything you know, everything you are to save this horse, to honor her memory. That's not selfishness. That's love. And maybe that's what she'd want. Not for you to destroy yourself with guilt, but to take what she loved and help it live again. Hank stared at him for a long moment, then looked away, his jaw working. When he spoke again, his voice was steadier. "You're wiser than your years, Ethan Wade." "No, sir. I just know what it's like to carry weight that isn't yours. My father's death wasn't my fault, but I carried it anyway. Made myself small because I thought that's what I deserved. But this horse, this impossible task, it's teaching me something. Sometimes the only way to let go of the past is to build something in the future." They sat together in silence as full darkness came to the valley, and somewhere in that silence, something shifted. The guilt would never fully leave Hank, Ethan understood, but maybe it could transform into something else, something that built instead of destroyed. The next morning brought crisis. Ethan arrived at dawn to find Hank already awake, his face grim. "We've got a problem." Windchaser was lying down, which wasn't unusual, but he was sweating despite the cool morning air, and his breathing was rapid and shallow. The left foreleg, the damaged one, was swollen to twice its normal size, hot to the touch, and the horse flinched violently when Hank pressed fingers to it. "Infections flared up," Hank said. "Probably been building for days and we missed it. The massage work, the exercise, it must have irritated something deep in the tissue. This is bad, Ethan, real bad." Grace arrived an hour later, summoned by a message Hank had sent via a ranch kid he trusted. She took one look at the leg and her face went pale. "It's cellulitis, bacterial infection in the deep tissue. If it gets into the bone, into the blood." She didn't finish the sentence. Didn't have to. They tried everything. Poultices of bread mold and charcoal, the old remedy that sometimes worked when modern medicine failed. Hot compresses followed by cold, trying to draw the infection to the surface. The carbolic acid Grace had brought, diluted and carefully applied to clean the wound. Windchaser's temperature climbed to 105 degrees. He stopped eating, stopped drinking, just lay there, sides heaving, eye glazed with fever. For 3 days they worked in shifts. Hank would take the night watch, Ethan the day, Grace slipping away whenever she could. They forced water down the horse's throat with a tube, applied the poultices every 2 hours, prayed to gods they weren't sure they believed in. On the 3rd night, Ethan sat beside Windchaser in the darkness, one hand resting on the horse's neck, feeling the fever heat radiating through the skin. The horse's breathing had changed, become irregular, gasping. This was the sound of a body giving up, of systems shutting down one by one. "Please," Ethan whispered. "Please don't die, not now, not when we've come this far. We need you. I need you. You have to fight. You have to remember that you're a champion, that you're Windchaser and you don't quit. You never quit." The horse's eye opened, that one clear brown eye, and for a moment it focused on Ethan. In that gaze was exhaustion beyond measure, pain beyond bearing. But there, still there, was that spark, smaller than before, guttering like a candle in the wind, but alive. Dawn came, the fever broke. Not dramatically, not all at once, but degree by degree over the next 6 hours. The swelling in the leg began to recede. The breathing steadied. And when Hank offered water, Windchaser drank on his own, no tube needed. "He's going to make it," Hank said, and his voice cracked on the words. "The stubborn, magnificent bastard is going to make it." They'd lost a week to the infection, a week of the precious 9 they had before the rodeo, but they'd gained something more valuable. They'd learned that Windchaser wasn't just refusing to die out of animal instinct. He was choosing to live, choosing to fight. And that choice, that act of will, changed everything. Recovery was slow. Another week of gentle care, of rebuilding strength lost to fever. But when they finally returned to the creek work, to the training routine, something was different. Windchaser moved with more purpose now. The limp, while still present, had lost some of its severity. The horse's eye was brighter. And for the first time since this had all begun, when Ethan arrived at the valley one morning, Windchaser lifted his head and whinnied in greeting. The sound sent chills down Ethan's spine. It was just a horse's whinny, nothing special. But it meant everything. It meant trust established. It meant Windchaser had decided that Ethan's arrival was something to welcome, not endure. "We've turned a corner," Hank said, watching the interaction with satisfaction. "The body's healing, the spirit's healing. Now comes the hard part. Now we find out if he can remember how to be what he was." 6 weeks had passed since that day on Buffalo's Main Street. 6 weeks since Clayton Mercer had handed Ethan a rope and a death sentence disguised as charity. The rodeo was 3 weeks away. 3 weeks to transform healing into performance, survival into excellence. The work intensified. Creek walking gave way to arena work in the small flat area at the valley's south end. Hank set up obstacles using fallen logs and sage brush, teaching Windchaser to navigate, to turn, to move with agility again. The horse was tentative at first, his body remembering pain even as it healed. But gradually, muscle memory began to override fear. And then one morning, Hank brought cattle. They were strays, technically belonging to Frank Holloway but wandering unclaimed in the breaks. Just 3 steers, rangy and half wild. Hank drove them into the valley and penned them in a makeshift corral. "Time to see if he remembers," Hank said. They saddled Windchaser for the first time in 2 years, used the lightest saddle Hank owned, positioned carefully to avoid the worst of the old sores. The horse flinched when the cinch tightened, but he didn't fight, trusted now that this wouldn't hurt him. Ethan swung into the saddle and for a moment just sat there, feeling the living warmth beneath him, the slight tremor of muscles, the subtle shift of weight as Windchaser adjusted to carrying a rider again. This was the moment. This was where they'd find out if 9 weeks of work had been enough. Hank opened the corral gate, and one steer bolted for freedom. For 3 heartbeats, nothing happened. Windchaser stood frozen, watching the steer run, and Ethan felt despair beginning to rise in his chest. The horse had forgotten. 6 weeks of healing hadn't been enough to undo 2 years of trauma. Then Windchaser's ears snapped forward. His entire body went taut, every muscle engaging. And without any cue from Ethan, without any command or guidance, the horse exploded into motion. He didn't just chase the steer. He anticipated it, read its movement like a language he'd spoken since birth. The steer dodged left and Windchaser was already turning, cutting the angle, forcing it back. The steer tried to break right and Windchaser was there, a wall of muscle and determination. It was poetry. It was physics. It was instinct elevated to art. They worked that steer back into the corral in under a minute, and when Windchaser stopped, sides heaving but eye bright with something that looked like joy, Hank was standing there with tears streaming down his weathered face. "He remembers," the old man whispered. "Sweet Lord above, he remembers everything." That night the 3 of them gathered around a small fire outside Hank's cabin. Ethan, Hank, and Grace, who'd managed to slip away for a few hours. They sat in silence, watching the flames, each lost in their own thoughts. 3 weeks, Grace finally said. 3 weeks until the rodeo, is it enough? "His body's ready," Hank said. "Near enough anyway. The leg's still weak, but it's functional. He's gained back most of the weight. The sores are healed. Physically, he can compete." "But," Ethan prompted. "But I don't know if he can handle the pressure. The crowd, the noise, the stress. He's been living quiet here, just us, no chaos. A rodeo is chaos. Hundreds of people shouting, other horses. If he spooks, if the old trauma comes back, all this work could unravel in seconds." They sat with that truth, heavy as stone. "We have to try," Grace said finally. "Even if he fails, even if we fail, We have to try. Because the alternative is letting my father win. Letting him believe that cruelty succeeds, that the broken stay broken, that the world is exactly as cold and hard as he thinks it is. She looked at Windchaser standing in the shelter outlined by moonlight. My mother believed in second chances, believed that with enough care, enough patience, enough love, anything could heal. I have to believe that too. I have to, or what was the point of any of it? Ethan reached out and took her hand, and on the other side, Hank did the same. Three people bound by an impossible mission, by shared grief, by stubborn hope that refused to die no matter how many times reality tried to kill it. The fire burned down to embers, and the Wyoming night settled around them, vast and star-scattered and indifferent. But in that small circle of warmth, something had been forged that couldn't be broken. Not by doubt, not by fear, not by the weight of everything that stood against them. They had 3 weeks. 3 weeks to prove that broken things could be made whole, that the lost could be found, that love, even when it came too late to save one life, could still save another. 3 weeks to show Buffalo, Wyoming, and Clayton Mercer, and themselves, that miracles weren't just stories people told. Sometimes, if you worked hard enough and believed deeply enough and refused to quit no matter what, miracles were real. The last embers faded, and in the darkness, Windchaser nickered softly, a sound of contentment, of trust, of a horse who'd remembered finally what it felt like to be home. The transformation was impossible to hide. That was the problem with miracles. They announced themselves whether you wanted them to or not. It started with small things. The liveryman at Morrison's stable noticed that the skeletal horse Ethan Wade had been given was looking less skeletal. A ranch hand spotted them on the trail north of town, saw how the animal moved with something approaching grace instead of that agonizing limp. The blacksmith's wife mentioned to her sister that young Ethan seemed different lately, walked taller, met people's eyes instead of staring at the ground. Gossip in a town of 800 people moved faster than prairie fire and was twice as hard to contain. By the end of week 7, everyone in Buffalo knew that something unusual was happening. The exact details were murky, obscured by distance and speculation, but the core truth was undeniable. The broken horse Clayton Mercer had given away as a joke was no longer broken. Ethan felt the shift in how people looked at him. The mockery hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had changed flavor. Now it carried an edge of uncertainty, of grudging curiosity. When he walked through town to pick up supplies, conversations would stutter and stop. Eyes would follow him, not with pity anymore, but with something closer to speculation. It was a Saturday morning, 2 weeks before the rodeo, when Ethan made the mistake of bringing Windchaser through Buffalo's Main Street. He'd needed to pick up a special liniment from the pharmacy, something Hank had ordered from Cheyenne, and the detour through town had seemed harmless enough. But he'd forgotten that Saturday was market day, when half the basin's population descended on Buffalo to trade and gossip. The reaction was immediate. A woman dropping her basket of eggs, the shells cracking against the boardwalk as she stared. A group of ranch hands who'd been loading supplies onto a wagon stopping mid-motion, their mouths falling open. The general murmur of commerce and conversation dying like someone had thrown a blanket over it. Because the horse walking down Main Street bore almost no resemblance to the dying animal Clayton Mercer had presented 8 weeks ago. Windchaser's coat shone like new copper in the morning sun, each hair lying sleek and healthy. The ribs that had once stood out like ladder rungs were now covered with proper muscle, the kind that came from hard work and good feed. His neck arched proud instead of hanging defeated. And while the limp was still there, faint but present in the left foreleg, it was no longer the stumbling gait of a cripple. It was barely a hitch, the kind of thing you'd only notice if you were looking for it. "Sweet Jesus," someone breathed, "that's not the same horse." Has to be, another voice countered. Look at the brand, that's Mercer's mark, sure as sunrise. The whispers built like a gathering storm. Ethan kept his eyes forward, his hands steady on the lead rope, walking with as much dignity as he could muster. He could feel the weight of every stare, hear the speculation building. This was exactly what Hank had warned him about. Visibility meant vulnerability. Once people started paying attention, they started having opinions. And opinions in a small town were dangerous things. He was tying Windchaser to the hitching post, outside the pharmacy, when a voice cut through the murmur. Ethan Wade, that's a fine-looking animal you have there. Ethan turned to find Frank Holloway approaching. Holloway was the second richest man in the Powder River Basin, a cattleman who'd built his fortune through shrewd deals and ruthless business practices. He was in his 50s, barrel-chested, with the kind of confidence that came from never having been told no. His boots alone probably cost more than Ethan's entire wardrobe. "Mr. Holloway," Ethan managed, his throat suddenly dry. Holloway circled Windchaser slowly, his eyes missing nothing. The way an expert evaluated livestock, cataloging value with every glance. "Heard some interesting rumors lately about how Clayton Mercer's charity case was looking surprisingly healthy. Thought it was just talk, but seeing it with my own eyes, well." He ran a hand along Windchaser's shoulder, professional and appraising. "This is remarkable work, truly remarkable." "Thank you, sir." "Planning to enter the rodeo, I hear, the cutting horse competition." Holloway's tone was casual, conversational, but his eyes were calculating. "That takes guts, or foolishness, hard to say which." Ethan said nothing, just waited. Men like Holloway didn't make small talk without purpose. "I'm going to make you an offer, son, a generous one, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." Holloway reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a leather wallet thick with bills. $200, cash, right now. All you have to do is withdraw from the competition. The number hit Ethan like a fist to the stomach. $200. More money than he'd see in 2 years of fence mending and odd jobs. Enough to fix their cabin's roof before winter. Enough to buy his mother a real coat instead of the threadbare one she'd been patching for 5 years. Enough to change their lives. "Why?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Holloway smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Let's call it a business decision. Clayton Mercer humiliated you in front of this entire town. If you race that horse and fail, it's just more of the same. You'll be the joke that keeps on giving, but if by some miracle you succeed, well." He paused meaningfully. "Then you've made Clayton look weak, and a weak Clayton Mercer is bad for business. The man controls too much around here. His pride keeps him predictable. I'd prefer him to stay that way." "So this isn't about me at all," Ethan said slowly. "It's about keeping Mr. Mercer in his place." "Smart boy, everything's about keeping someone in their place. That's how the world works." Holloway pulled out a stack of bills, counted off $200 with the casual ease of someone for whom that amount was pocket change. "Here's what I'm offering. You take this money. You tell people the horse isn't ready, that you were foolish to think you could compete. You save yourself the embarrassment of public failure. And I get to watch Clayton Mercer continue his slow slide into bitter old age, unchallenged and uninteresting." The money sat there between them, green and crisp and impossible. Ethan could smell it, that particular scent of ink and paper that somehow always smelled like possibility. His hand actually started to reach for it before he stopped himself. "I need to think about it," Ethan said. "Of course you do." Holloway tucked the money back into his wallet, but slowly, making sure Ethan saw every bill. "You've got until Wednesday. After that, the offer expires. I'll be at Morrison's General Store at noon. You know where to find me." He walked away, leaving Ethan standing there with Windchaser, his heart hammering and his mind spinning. $200. The number kept echoing in his head, growing larger with each repetition. $200. The ride back to the hidden valley was the longest 12 miles of Ethan's life. Every step of the way, he did the math. What $200 could buy, what it could fix, how much suffering it could prevent. His mother's hands, red and swollen from endless washing. The leak in the roof that got worse every rain. The careful way they portioned food to make it last, going to bed hungry more nights than not. What right did he have to refuse that money? What right did he have to gamble their future on something as uncertain as a horse race? Pride was a luxury for people who could afford it, and the Wades had never been able to afford much of anything. Hank took one look at Ethan's face when he arrived and knew something was wrong. What happened? Ethan told him. Every word of Holloway's offer, every dollar, every temptation. And as he spoke, he felt the shame building in his chest because he was actually considering it, actually thinking about taking the money and walking away. When he finished, Hank was quiet for a long time. Then he walked to where Windchaser was grazing and stood there, one hand resting on the horse's neck. "You know what the hardest thing about training horses is," Hank finally said. "It's not teaching them skills. Horses are smart, they learn quick. The hard part is teaching them to trust their training when everything in their body is screaming at them to run. That moment when a cutting horse has to commit, has to trust that if he makes the move his rider's asking for, it'll work out. That's the moment that separates good horses from champions." He turned to look at Ethan. "Right now, you're in that moment. Everything in you is screaming that the safe choice is to take the money and run. And maybe it is the safe choice. But safe and right aren't always the same thing." "My mother," Ethan started, but Hank held up a hand. "Your mother didn't raise a coward, and she didn't raise a fool. She raised a young man who looked at a dying horse and saw something worth saving, who worked himself half to death for 8 weeks because he made a promise. You think she'd rather have $200 or a son who knows what he's worth?" The words hit harder than Holloway's money ever could. Ethan sank down onto a rock, his head in his hands. "I don't know if I can do this, Hank. The race, the pressure. What if we fail? What if all this work was for nothing?" "Then we fail," Hank said simply. "We fail, and we pick ourselves up and we go on. But we fail trying, not because we took a bribe to quit before we even started." He sat down beside Ethan. "Clayton Mercer tried to destroy this horse because he couldn't face his own grief. Frank Holloway's trying to buy your silence because he's more interested in power games than people. And you're sitting here thinking about giving them both exactly what they want. Is that really who you are?" Ethan looked at Windchaser, at the horse that had somehow become more than just an animal, had become a symbol of everything he hoped he could be, strong despite being broken, proud despite being beaten down, still fighting despite every reason to quit. "No," Ethan said quietly. "No, that's not who I am." "Then I guess you have your answer." That night Ethan told his mother about the offer. They sat at their small table, a single candle burning between them, and he laid it all out. The money, the temptation, his decision. Ruth Wade listened in silence, her work-worn hands folded in her lap. When Ethan finished, she reached across the table and took his hand. "Your father," she said softly, "used to say that a man's character isn't built in the easy moments. It's built when he has to choose between what's comfortable and what's right. And he always chose right, even when it cost him." Her eyes glistened in the candlelight. "It cost him his life in the end, trying to help someone who didn't deserve it. But he died knowing who he was. And I'd rather have that memory of him than any amount of money." "We need the money, Ma. You can't pretend we don't." "We do," she agreed. "But we'll find it another way, we always have. And Ethan, I need you to understand something. I've watched you these past 8 weeks. Watched you wake up before dawn and come home after dark. Watched you work harder than any 17-year-old should have to work, and I've seen you change. You walk different now. Hold your head up. You're becoming the man your father hoped you'd be." She squeezed his hand. "You can't buy that with $200. You can't buy it with any amount of money, and I won't let you sell it either." Wednesday came. Noon found Ethan standing outside Morrison's general store, but not to accept Holloway's offer. He was there to buy grain when Holloway emerged from inside, saw him, and smiled. "Made your decision, son?" "Yes, sir. Thank you for the offer, but I'm racing." Holloway's smile faded. For just a moment, something cold flickered across his face. "That's a mistake, boy. A bad one. You're throwing away security for pride. That horse will break down mid-race, and you'll be left with nothing but humiliation." "Maybe," Ethan said, "but it'll be my humiliation. I'll have earned it honest." "Fool," Holloway muttered, brushing past him. But as he walked away, he called back over his shoulder, "Don't say I didn't warn you when it all falls apart." The encounter left Ethan shaken but resolved. He'd made his choice. Now all that remained was to prove it had been the right one. But if Ethan thought refusing Holloway's bribe was the end of the pressure, he was wrong. Word of the offer spread, as everything did in Buffalo, and with it came a new wave of speculation. Some people admired Ethan's refusal. Others thought him an idiot. But everyone had an opinion, and everyone wanted to share it. The worst part was the attention it brought to Grace. People started noticing that Catherine Mercer's daughter had been unusually absent lately, that she seemed tired, distracted, that there were smudges of dirt on her fine dresses that no amount of careful laundering could explain. The gossip built in whispers and knowing looks, and gossip, in a place like Buffalo, had a way of reaching the wrong ears. It was Grace who brought the news to the valley, riding in at midnight, her face pale and frightened in the moonlight. "My father knows," she said without preamble. "He doesn't know details, but he knows I've been sneaking out. He's had someone watching me." "Did he confront you?" Hank asked, his voice tight. "Not directly, but at dinner tonight he made comments about loyalty, about family, about how the people who betray you are always the ones closest to you." Her hands were shaking. "I've been so careful, but not careful enough. If he finds out what I've been doing, if he finds out about the supplies, about helping you—" "He'll cut you off," Hank finished. "Worse than that. He'll make sure I can never help anyone again. He'll marry me off to some business associate, ship me to Denver or San Francisco, anywhere that gets me away from here and under someone else's control." Grace's voice cracked. "I'm not afraid for myself. But if he stops the medicine, stops the grain this close to the race—" Ethan felt cold dread settling in his stomach. They were 2 weeks out. 2 weeks from the rodeo, from the moment when all this work would either justify itself or collapse into ruin. And now the support structure they'd relied on was threatening to crumble. "We need to accelerate the timeline," Hank said, his mind already working. "Get the final supplies now tonight, enough to see us through to race day without needing anything else. Can you do that, Miss Grace? One more run, a big one, and then you stay away. Stay visible. Give your father no reason to suspect." Grace nodded, her jaw set with determination that reminded Ethan achingly of her mother, the woman he'd never met but felt he knew through everyone's memories. "I can get what we need. The storeroom, I know where he keeps the keys, but it has to be tonight. Tomorrow he's having the locks changed." They loaded her horse with everything that could be carried. Grain, medicine, bandages, extra tack, enough to sustain Windchaser through the final 2 weeks of intensive training. It took 3 trips, Grace riding back and forth between the valley and her father's ranch, each trip riskier than the last. But she managed it. By dawn, they had what they needed. "That's the last time," Grace said, exhausted and dirt-streaked but triumphant. From here on, you're on your own, but you have everything you need to finish this." She looked at Windchaser, at the horse her mother had loved, and something in her expression softened. "Win or lose, we did something good here. We took something my father tried to destroy and we made it whole. That matters. No matter what happens in that arena, that matters." Then she was gone, riding back toward Buffalo and the big house, and the father who was watching her with increasing suspicion. The final 2 weeks were a blur of intensity that left Ethan wondering how he'd functioned before on what now seemed like so little effort. Hank drove them both, horse and rider, with relentless precision. The work with cattle became more complex, more demanding. Not just separating one steer anymore, but working multiple animals, reading the herd dynamics, anticipating movement 3 steps ahead. Windchaser was magnificent. Every day, Ethan felt more of the champion emerging from beneath the layers of trauma and neglect. The horse's movements became fluid, economical, precise. He could stop on a dime, spin on his hindquarters, accelerate from standstill to full gallop in 3 strides. The limp was still there, a reminder of damage that could never be completely undone. But it didn't slow him. If anything, it seemed to make him more determined, as if he was proving to himself as much as to anyone watching that he was more than his injury. But it was the partnership between horse and rider that truly transformed. Ethan learned to read Windchaser's body language, to feel the subtle shifts in weight and muscle that telegraphed the horse's intentions. And Windchaser learned to trust Ethan's cues, to respond to the lightest pressure of leg or rein. They were becoming what Hank called a team, 2 beings moving as one. "You're ready," Hank said on the Thursday before the Saturday race. "Physically, mentally, you're as ready as you're going to be. Now it's just a matter of execution." But that night, their fragile world came crashing down. Clayton Mercer arrived at the hidden valley just after sunset, riding alone, his face a mask of cold fury. He didn't shout, didn't make threats, just sat on his horse at the valley entrance and spoke in a voice that carried like judgment. "Ethan Wade, I know you're here, come out." Ethan emerged from Hank's cabin, his heart hammering. How had Clayton found them? Who had talked? The valley's location had been a carefully guarded secret, but secrets in small towns never stayed secret forever. Clayton dismounted, his movements deliberate and controlled. He was a man who'd mastered the art of intimidation through stillness rather than violence. "I'm going to tell you this once. You will not race that horse." "It was a gift, Mr. Mercer," Ethan said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "You gave him to me publicly. You can't take that back." "It was a joke," Clayton bit out, his composure cracking. "It was meant to be a lesson in humility. You were supposed to take him, realize the impossibility of the situation, and have the sense to put him out of his misery. You were not supposed to." He gestured at Windchaser, words failing him. "You were not supposed to fix him. He's a good horse. He deserved a chance to run." "He was my wife's horse," Clayton roared, and suddenly all the careful control was gone, replaced by raw anguish. "He belonged to the only good thing in my miserable life. She loved that animal more than she loved anything, more than she loved our daughter, more than she loved me. And every time I looked at him, all I could see was her riding away from me, choosing him over me, dying for him." The confession hung in the air, naked and terrible. Ethan saw the man behind the mask for the first time. Not a villain, just someone drowning in grief and taking everyone down with him. "She didn't die for him, Mr. Mercer. She died in an accident. That's not the same thing." "You don't get to tell me about my wife's death," Clayton said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. "You don't get to stand there, a child, and explain grief to me. I know what I lost. And I know that parading that horse in front of the entire basin, making a spectacle of him, is an insult to her memory." No, sir, with respect, it's the opposite. It honors her. She loved this horse. She'd want him to run again. Clayton stared at him for a long moment, and Ethan saw the war playing out behind those cold blue eyes. Rage versus reason. Past versus present. Finally, Clayton spoke, and his voice had the finality of a door closing. If you race tomorrow, I will evict 12 families from properties they rent from me. Everyone who I've seen supporting you, helping you, encouraging this foolishness. Your mother included. 46 people, Ethan. 46 people will be homeless because of your pride. Can you live with that? The threat hit like a physical blow. Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. This wasn't about money or humiliation anymore. This was about real consequences for real people. Families who'd shown him kindness. Neighbors who'd encouraged him. All of them would suffer because of a choice he made. You can't do that, Ethan said, but even as he spoke, he knew Clayton could. The man owned half the basin. He could do whatever he wanted. I can and I will. You have until noon tomorrow to withdraw from the race. After that, the eviction notices go out. Clayton mounted his horse, looking down at Ethan from that position of literal and metaphorical height. I'm not a monster, boy. I'm giving you a choice. Your pride or their homes. Choose wisely. He rode away, leaving Ethan standing in the gathering darkness, the weight of 46 lives suddenly pressing down on his shoulders. Hank emerged from the cabin where he'd been listening. His face was grim. He means it. Clayton Mercer doesn't make empty threats. I know. Ethan sank down onto a rock, his hands shaking. God, Hank, I can't do that to them. I can't make 46 people homeless because I want to race a horse. That's not pride. That's selfishness. You're right, Hank said quietly. It would be selfish, if that's what this was about. What else could it be about? It's about Clayton Mercer using power to crush anything that challenges his version of reality. It's about him punishing the world because he can't punish himself. And it's about whether we let men like him win just because they have the power to hurt us. Hank sat down beside Ethan. But here's what I'm telling you. This is your choice. Not mine, not Grace's, not those 12 families. Yours. If you decide to withdraw, I won't judge you. Neither will anyone who matters. Sometimes the brave thing is knowing when to quit. They sat in silence as full darkness settled over the valley. Somewhere in that darkness, Windchaser whinnied softly, a sound of contentment, of trust. The sound of a horse who'd learned, finally, that the world could be kind. Ethan thought about his mother, about the neighbors who'd pledged support even knowing the risk, about Grace, who'd risked everything to smuggle supplies, about Hank, who'd poured his guilt and his love and his expertise into resurrection, about Windchaser, who'd fought so hard to survive, to heal, to remember what he'd once been. And he thought about Clayton Mercer, alone in his big house, surrounded by wealth and empty of joy, trying to control the world because he couldn't control his own grief. What was the point of all this? What was the point of 8 weeks of brutal work, of healing, of transformation, if at the end they just surrendered because a powerful man said so? I need to talk to the families, Ethan said finally. Before I decide anything, they deserve to know what's at stake. That night he rode to Buffalo and knocked on 12 doors. At each one, he explained Clayton's threat, laid out the consequences, gave them the chance to tell him to withdraw, to save their homes. And at each door he got the same response. My boy, Old Man Patterson said, gripping Ethan's shoulder with a hand gnarled from 70 years of work. I've lived in this basin my whole life. I've watched men like Clayton Mercer push people around because they can, and I'm tired of it. You race that horse. You show him that there are some things money can't buy and power can't break. And if I end up sleeping under the stars because of it, well, I've slept in worse places. The last house he visited was his own. Ruth Wade listened to everything, her face calm, and when he finished, she smiled. "Do you remember what your father said the day before he died? He told me, Ruth, if I don't stand up for what's right when it costs me nothing, how can I stand up when it costs everything? He died living by that. And I won't dishonor his memory by teaching our son to do anything different." She took Ethan's face in her hands. "You race tomorrow. You race for yourself, for that horse, for everyone who's been pushed down and told to stay there. And whatever happens after, we'll face it together." Ethan rode back to the valley as dawn was breaking, his decision made. He found Hank already awake, preparing Windchaser for the journey to Buffalo. "We racing?" Hank asked. "We're racing," Ethan confirmed. Hank nodded, a fierce pride lighting his weathered face. "Then let's show them what honest work looks like. Let's show them what happens when you refuse to quit." The sun climbed over the Bighorn Mountains, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber. Windchaser stood in that light, coat shining, head high, every inch the champion he'd been born to be. And looking at him, Ethan felt something settle in his chest. Not certainty, not confidence, but something deeper and more enduring. Purpose. Whatever happened in that arena tomorrow, whatever consequences came after, they would face them knowing they'd done something impossible. They'd taken a broken thing and made it whole. They'd stood up to power and refused to bend. They'd chosen honor over comfort, purpose over safety. And sometimes that had to be enough. The journey to Buffalo began at noon, giving them time to arrive, settle, and rest before race day. As they left the hidden valley, Ethan looked back once, at the place where a miracle had happened, where a dying horse had learned to live again, where a poor boy had learned what he was worth. Then he turned forward, toward Buffalo, toward the rodeo, toward whatever fate waited. Windchaser walked beside him, strong and steady, and for the first time in weeks, Ethan wasn't afraid. The storm was gathering, but they were ready to face it. The morning of the Powder River Rodeo dawned hot and still, the kind of August day where the air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to break. By 6 in the morning, the temperature was already climbing past 70 degrees, and the sky was a hard, cloudless blue that promised no mercy from the sun. It was going to be a scorcher, the kind of day that tested both man and beast. Ethan had been awake since 3, unable to sleep, his mind spinning through everything that could go wrong. The what-ifs circled like vultures. What if Windchaser's leg gave out mid-run? What if the crowd noise spooked him back into trauma? What if 8 weeks of work collapsed in 8 seconds of failure? The doubts were relentless, but beneath them ran a deeper current. A strange calm that came from knowing he'd done everything possible. Win or lose, he could look himself in the mirror afterward. He'd spent the hours before dawn with Windchaser, grooming the horse until his coat gleamed like polished copper, braiding his mane with careful precision, checking and rechecking every inch for any sign of injury or weakness. The horse stood patient through it all, as if he understood the weight of what was coming. In the pre-dawn darkness, Ethan had pressed his forehead against Windchaser's neck and whispered the only prayer he knew. "Just do your best, boy, that's all I'm asking. Just show them who you really are." By 8 in the morning, Buffalo had transformed. The tiny town of 800 permanent residents had swelled to nearly 5,000. People had traveled from across Wyoming territory, from Montana and Colorado, drawn by word of mouth about the best rodeo in the basin. But more than that, drawn by the story. The impossible story of a dying horse and a poor boy that had spread like wildfire through saloons and trading posts and ranch houses across 3 territories. The main street was chaos. Wagons and horses and people everywhere, a river of humanity flowing toward the rodeo grounds on the eastern edge of town. Vendors sold everything from fresh lemonade to betting slips. Children ran wild, drunk on excitement and sugar candy. The smell of frying food mixed with dust and horse sweat and human anticipation, creating a sensory wall that was almost overwhelming. Ethan led Windchaser through the crowd and the reaction was immediate. Conversation stopped mid-word. Heads turned. Fingers pointed. The whispers built like a gathering wave. "That's him. That's the horse Mercer gave away." "Can't be. Look at him. That's a champion." "I'm telling you it's the same horse. See the brand. That's Mercer's mark." "Impossible. Nothing could recover like that. Nothing." The attention made Ethan's skin crawl, but he kept his eyes forward, his hands steady on the lead rope. Windchaser walked beside him with his head high, ears forward, taking in the chaos with curiosity rather than fear. 8 weeks ago, this crowd would have sent him into trembling panic. Now he moved through it like he owned the world. They'd been assigned space in the competitor's paddock, a fenced area where the 8 horses entered in the cutting competition were being prepared. The moment Ethan led Windchaser through the gate, he felt the weight of professional scrutiny. These weren't town gossips. These were horsemen, real horsemen, who made their living in the saddle. And they were looking at Windchaser the way experts looked at something that didn't quite make sense. A tall man in his 40s approached, his face weathered by sun and wind, his eyes shrewd. "You're the Wade boy, heard about you. That's Mercer's old champion, isn't it? Windchaser." "Yes, sir." "Thought he was dead or close enough to it." The man walked a slow circle around the horse, missing nothing. "This is remarkable work, truly remarkable. Who trained him back?" "Hank Dawson mostly. I just helped." The man's eyebrows rose. Hank Dawson. Haven't heard that name in years. Thought Mercer ran him out of the territory. "He tried," a familiar voice said. Hank emerged from the crowd, looking smaller somehow in the press of people, but his spine was steel straight and his eyes were clear. "But some things you can't run off. Some things stick." The tall man nodded slowly. "Good to see you, Hank. Damn good to see you. Though I'll tell you straight, you're facing tough competition today. My geldings won the last 3 rodeos. And Mercer's entry, that black stallion of his, that's as fine an animal as I've seen." "We're not here to win," Hank said quietly. "We're here to run. Everything else is just details." But as the morning progressed toward noon and the start of competition, it became clear that not everyone shared Hank's philosophical approach. The atmosphere in the paddock shifted from curious to hostile. Other competitors started making comments, not quite loud enough to be direct confrontation, but loud enough to be heard. "Charity Case thinks he can compete with real horsemen." "That nag won't last 1 round, probably collapse mid-run." "Whole thing's a joke, should have stayed a joke." Ethan tried to ignore it, but the words burrowed under his skin like splinters. These weren't just casual observers. These were men who dedicated their lives to horses, and they were dismissing everything he'd done, everything Windchaser had overcome. The worst came from Clayton Mercer's rider, a professional brought in from Cheyenne specifically for this competition. He was in his 30s, compact and muscular, with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never been told he wasn't the best. His name was Vance, and he made sure everyone knew he'd won major competitions from Denver to San Francisco. He sauntered over to where Ethan was adjusting Windchaser's bridle and looked the horse up and down with theatrical skepticism. "So this is the famous resurrection project. Got to admit, you cleaned him up nice. Almost looks like a real horse now." "He is a real horse," Ethan said, keeping his voice level. "Sure, until the pressure hits, then we'll see what he really is." Vance leaned in closer, lowering his voice so only Ethan could hear. "Between you and me, kid, you should pull out now. Save yourself the embarrassment. That leg of his, I can see the weakness in it. Minute he has to make a hard cut, it'll give out. And when it does, in front of 5,000 people, you'll be the punchline everyone remembers." Thanks for the concern, Ethan managed through clenched teeth. Vance smiled, the kind of smile that had no warmth in it. Just trying to help. Mr. Mercer's paying me good money to win today, but he's paying me extra to make sure you lose badly. So when I get the chance, I'm going to cut you off, force your horse into positions that'll expose that bad leg. Nothing illegal, just competitive. And that champion you think you've got, he's going to break. I guarantee it. He walked away, leaving Ethan standing there with rage burning in his chest. Hank appeared at his elbow, having heard the whole exchange. "Ignore him," Hank said. "Men like that talk big because they're afraid. They see what you've done and it scares them because it makes their own accomplishments look smaller." He's right about the leg, though. It is weak. If Windchaser has to make hard cuts, sustained pressure, then we trust him to know his limits, and we trust ourselves to work around them. Hank gripped Ethan's shoulder. "Listen to me. You've got something none of these other riders have. You've got a partnership. You and Windchaser, you built something together from nothing. They've got skilled horses and skilled riders, but you've got trust. And when it comes down to it, trust beats skill every time." The announcement echoed across the grounds. "Cutting horse competition. All riders to the arena. First round begins in 15 minutes. The walk from the paddock to the arena felt like walking to an execution. The crowd had grown even larger, packed into the grandstands and spilling out along the fences. 5,000 people, maybe more, all of them talking, shouting, placing last-minute bets. The noise was a physical force, a wall of sound that pressed against Ethan's chest. He could see Clayton Mercer in the judge's box, elevated above the crowd, his face expressionless. And beside him, trying to be invisible, was Grace. She looked terrified, her hands gripping the railing so hard her knuckles were white. When she saw Ethan, she mouthed 2 words: "I'm sorry." Ruth Wade was in the stands, 3rd row back, surrounded by the 12 families who'd pledged their support. They looked defiant and proud and scared all at once. His mother caught his eye and pressed her hand to her heart, a gesture that said everything words couldn't. The arena was a circular space perhaps 100 feet in diameter, fenced with rough timber, the dirt packed hard from a summer of use. At one end was a chute where cattle would be released. The rules were simple. 8 riders would compete in elimination rounds. Each rider would enter the arena, a steer would be released, and the rider had to separate that steer from a small herd and drive it to the opposite end of the arena. Fastest time advanced. Cleanest technique scored points. 3 rounds total, field narrowing from 8 to 4 to 2. Winner took the $300 prize and the title. Ethan drew position number 6. He'd have to watch 5 other riders go before his turn. 5 opportunities to psych himself out, to see how good the competition really was. The first rider was competent but unspectacular. Decent time, clean separation, no major mistakes. The second rider was better, shaving 3 seconds off the first time. The third rider, the tall man who'd spoken to Ethan earlier, was excellent. His horse moved like liquid, reading the steer's intentions before the animal knew them itself. The crowd roared its approval. Fourth was Vance on Clayton Mercer's Black Stallion, and watching him, Ethan understood why he'd been brought in from Cheyenne. He wasn't just good, he was brilliant. The stallion was a machine of controlled power, and Vance rode with the kind of precision that came from thousands of hours in the saddle. They separated the steer and drove it across the arena in 38 seconds, the fastest time yet. The crowd went wild. Fifth was another solid competitor, nothing special. And then it was Ethan's turn. He swung onto Windchaser's back, no saddle, just a blanket and a simple bridle, the way they'd trained. The moment he settled into position, he felt Windchaser's muscles bunch beneath him, felt the horse's attention sharpen and focus. They moved toward the arena entrance together, and Ethan could feel his heart hammering so hard he thought it might crack a rib. The announcer's voice boomed across the grounds. Next rider, Ethan Wade on Windchaser, owned by Clayton Mercer. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some cheered, caught up in the underdog story. Others laughed, expecting entertainment of the wrong kind. But beneath it all was a current of genuine curiosity. They wanted to see if the rumors were true, if the miracle was real. Ethan entered the arena and the noise hit him like a fist. 5,000 voices, all talking at once, creating a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Windchaser's ears pinned back, not in anger but in concentration, filtering out the chaos, focusing on what mattered. The gate opened, the steer bolted. And for 3 heartbeats, nothing happened. Windchaser stood frozen, watching the steer run. Ethan felt panic beginning to claw at his throat. The horse had locked up. The crowd noise, the pressure, something had triggered the old trauma. They were going to fail before they even started. Then, like a switch being thrown, Windchaser's entire body engaged. He didn't just move. He exploded. 0 to full gallop in 3 strides, muscles firing with the kind of power that Ethan had felt in training but never quite believed. The steer was fast, but Windchaser was faster. He closed the gap in seconds, and then something extraordinary happened. The limp disappeared. Not faded, not compensated for, disappeared. As if the damaged tendon, the old injury, the physical limitation that had defined him for 2 years, simply ceased to exist. Windchaser moved with perfect fluidity, reading the steer's panic, cutting angles with geometric precision. The steer tried to dodge left. Windchaser was there, blocking, forcing it back to center. The steer tried to fake right, then break left. Windchaser didn't fall for it, stayed planted, then exploded into the turn with power that seemed impossible. They were dancing now, horse and steer, predator and prey, but there was never any doubt about how it would end. Windchaser drove the steer across the arena in 35 seconds, 3 seconds faster than Vance, the second fastest time of the round. The crowd's roar shifted from curiosity to genuine awe. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't a charity case getting lucky. This was a champion announcing his return. Ethan slid off Windchaser's back on shaking legs, and Hank was there, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Did you see?" the old man was saying. "Did you see?" He remembered everything. The second round was harder. 4 riders remaining. The task was more complex now. 3 steers released at once. Rider had to separate one specific marked steer and drive it to a pen while preventing the other 2 from following. Required not just speed but strategy, not just power but precision. Ethan drew 3rd position. He'd watched 2 competitors before his run. The first rider, the tall man, executed perfectly. Clean separation, good time, 42 seconds. The second rider, Vance, was even better. He made it look easy, the black stallion moving with machine precision. 39 seconds. Then it was Ethan's turn again. 3 steers charged into the arena, scattering. The marked one had a blue ribbon tied to its horn. Ethan scanned, found it, and guided Windchaser forward. The horse's attention locked onto the target like a rifle sight. But Vance hadn't been bluffing about making this difficult. He was positioned at the arena fence, ostensibly just watching, but as Windchaser approached the marked steer, the black stallion snorted loudly, a sharp, aggressive sound that made the cattle panic. They scattered hard, the marked steer bolting toward the far fence at a dead run. It was sabotage. Not illegal, just strategic harassment. And it worked. The marked steer mixed into the other 2, creating confusion. Ethan had to circle wide, reset, try again, precious seconds ticking away. But Windchaser didn't panic, didn't lock up. He just adjusted, reading the new pattern, finding his opening. When it came, he took it. A gap between two steers, barely wide enough. Windchaser shot through it, separated the marked steer, and drove it toward the pen with relentless pressure. The steer tried everything. Dodged, feinted, attempted to circle back. Windchaser matched every move, anticipated every trick. And then, in the final 20 feet, disaster struck. The steer made a desperate cut to the left, the hardest kind of turn, the kind that put maximum stress on a horse's foreleg. Windchaser had to match it or lose the steer. No choice. He planted his left foreleg and turned. Ethan felt something give. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, but he felt it. A slight hitch in the smoothness, a microsecond of hesitation. The old injury protesting the strain. But Windchaser didn't stop, didn't slow. He pushed through whatever pain was screaming in that leg and drove the steer into the pen. Final time, 41 seconds, good enough to advance. When Ethan dismounted, he immediately checked the leg. It was warm, warmer than it should be. Not swollen yet, but stressed. Hank ran his expert hands over it, his face grim. "He's hurting," Hank said quietly. "Not bad yet, but it's building. One more round like that and we risk real damage." "Should we withdraw?" Ethan asked, though the words felt like swallowing glass. Hank looked at Windchaser, at the horse standing proud despite the pain, ears forward, ready for more. "That's not my call. That's his. And looking at him, I don't think he wants to quit." The finals, 2 riders, Ethan weighed on Windchaser, Vance on Clayton Mercer's Black Stallion. The final task was the hardest of all. 5 steers, one marked with a red ribbon. Rider had to separate the marked steer and drive it through a series of gates at opposite ends of the arena, a serpentine path that required constant turning, constant cuts, constant stress on horse and rider both. The crowd had gone from 5,000 to what felt like 10,000. Word had spread beyond the rodeo grounds. People were streaming in from town, climbing on rooftops and wagons for a view. This wasn't just a competition anymore. This was history happening in real time. The return of a legend versus the pride of a bitter man. Redemption versus power. The story had grown beyond the 2 riders in the arena. Vance went first. He was perfect. Flawless execution, the Black Stallion moving like a dancer, never wasting a step. Through the first gate, hard turn to the second, serpentine through the third and fourth, final drive to the 5th gate. 53 seconds. The crowd went wild. It was a time that seemed unbeatable. Vance trotted the stallion past where Ethan waited, and he smiled that cold smile. "Your turn, kid. Try not to embarrass yourself too badly." Ethan mounted Windchaser and immediately felt the difference. The horse was hurting, not catastrophically, but hurting. The left foreleg was definitely compromised. He could feel the slight tremble in the muscle, the heat radiating through. "We can stop," Ethan whispered, leaning forward so his lips were near the horse's ear. "I won't think less of you. You've already proven everything. We can stop right now." Windchaser's ears swiveled back, listening. Then forward again, locked on the arena entrance. His answer was clear. "We finish this." They entered the arena, and the crowd's roar was deafening. But Ethan barely heard it. His entire world had narrowed to the horse beneath him, the marked steer ahead, and the serpentine path they had to navigate. The gate opened. 5 steers scattered. Ethan found the marked one, guided Windchaser forward. The horse moved, and Ethan felt the limp return. Not terrible, not crippling, but present. A visible hitch in the stride. The crowd saw it too. The roar dimmed, replaced by uncertain murmurs. First gate approached. The marked steer tried to dodge. Windchaser cut it off, forced it through. Hard left turn to the 2nd gate. The leg protested. Ethan felt the horse's stride stutter for just a moment. "Easy, boy, easy. We've got time." But they didn't have time. Vance's 53 seconds hung over them like a judgment. They needed to be fast, needed to push, but pushing meant pain. Second gate, third gate. The steer was getting tired, less willing to run, but the serpentine pattern was brutal. Left turn, left again. Each one putting stress on that foreleg. Each one asking Windchaser to give more than the injury wanted to allow. Fourth gate approached. The steer made a desperate break, trying to escape back into the open arena. Windchaser had to stop it, had to make the hardest cut yet, the kind of turn that would either save the run or end everything. Ethan felt the horse gathering himself beneath the saddle, felt the decision being made. Windchaser planted the left foreleg and turned. The snap was audible even over the crowd noise. Not bone, thank God, but something in the tendon giving way, scar tissue tearing. Windchaser stumbled, nearly went down. For a horrible second, Ethan thought they were going to crash, that the horse was going to fall, and that would be the end of everything. But Windchaser caught himself. Somehow, impossibly, he caught himself, and he kept moving. The limp was pronounced now, visible to everyone. A three-legged gait that should have stopped any other horse. But Windchaser had spent 2 years learning to move through pain, had built his entire existence around refusing to quit, and he wasn't about to start now. He drove the steer toward the fourth gate, through it, one more to go, the final gate, 50 yards away, might as well have been 50 miles. The crowd had gone silent. Not the silence of waiting, but the silence of witnessing something that transcended competition. Every person in those stands knew they were watching something extraordinary. Not a perfect performance, but something more important. They were watching courage made visible. Windchaser limped toward the final gate. Each step was agony. Each step was defiance. The steer was exhausted, barely resisting anymore, but it didn't matter. The gate seemed to retreat with every stride. 40 yards, 30, 20. Ethan was crying now, openly weeping, but he didn't stop. Didn't ask the horse to quit, because Windchaser wasn't quitting, wasn't slowing, was giving everything he had, everything he was to finish what they'd started. 10 yards, 5. They drove the steer through the final gate and the timer stopped. 1 minute, 12 seconds, 19 seconds slower than Vance, not even close. They'd lost. But when Ethan slid off Windchaser's back and the crowd erupted not in mockery but in thunderous applause, when 5,000 people rose to their feet in standing ovation, when grown men wiped tears from their eyes and women sobbed openly, he understood something fundamental. They hadn't lost. They'd won something that mattered more than any trophy. They'd won their dignity back, their self-respect, their right to stand in that arena and be counted. Hank was there, his arms around both Ethan and the horse, all three of them standing in the center of that arena while the crowd roared. And through the noise, Ethan heard one voice that cut through everything else. Stop the ceremony, stop everything. Clayton Mercer was descending from the judge's box, walking across the arena with slow, heavy steps. The crowd quieted, confused. Vance sat on the black stallion, uncertain, his victory suddenly feeling hollow. Clayton stopped in front of Ethan, in front of Windchaser, and for a long moment just stood there, staring at the horse, at the animal his wife had loved, at the creature he'd tried to destroy. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion, aimed at the entire crowd but meant for the horse. My wife Catherine loved this horse more than she loved anything in the world, and when she died I couldn't face that love, couldn't face the reminder of what I'd lost, so I tried to erase him, tried to make him disappear. His voice broke. I am looking at more courage in this horse than I've shown in 2 years, more heart than I have in my entire body. He turned to Ethan. You didn't just heal his body, you healed his spirit, You gave him back something I tried to take away, his purpose, his pride, his right to run." Clayton's eyes were wet with tears. "You honored my wife better than I ever did." Then Clayton Mercer did something no one expected. He turned to the judge's box and made an announcement that would become legend. "I'm withdrawing my entry. Vance rode perfectly, but he rode for money. This boy and this horse rode for something that matters more. They rode for each other, and that deserves to be recognized." He pulled an envelope from his jacket. "The $300 prize, it's yours, Ethan Wade, you earned it." He paused. "But more than that, I'm offering you and your mother a home on my ranch, not as servants, as family. And I'm asking you if you'll have me to help me build something Catherine would have been proud of. A sanctuary for horses that need second chances. Because if this horse can come back from what I did to him, maybe there's hope for broken people too." The arena exploded. Not just applause, but cheering, crying, a release of emotion that had been building for 9 weeks. Grace was running across the arena, throwing her arms around her father, both of them sobbing. Ruth Wade was climbing over the fence, crushing Ethan in an embrace. The 12 families were chanting Ethan's name. But Ethan barely registered any of it. His entire focus was on Windchaser, on making sure the horse was okay, that the injury wasn't catastrophic. Hank was already examining the leg, his expert hands gentle. After a long moment, he looked up with relief. "Tendon strained but not torn. He'll need rest. Lots of it. No more racing probably ever, but he'll heal. He'll be able to walk to live a good life." Ethan pressed his forehead against Windchaser's neck, breathing in the smell of horse and sweat and victory that wasn't about winning. "You did it," he whispered. "You showed them. You showed everyone what honest courage looks like." And the horse, the champion, the survivor, the living embodiment of second chances, stood in that arena surrounded by love he'd earned and respect he demanded, and he was finally, truly home. The days following the rodeo felt like waking from a dream into a reality that was somehow better than the dream itself. Ethan kept expecting to open his eyes and find himself back in the drafty cabin, back to mending fences for $3 a week, back to being invisible. But every morning he woke to find the impossible had become permanent. The move to the Mercer Ranch happened within a week. Clayton insisted, and for once his insistence came from generosity rather than control. The ranch house had more rooms than Ethan had ever seen in one building, but Clayton gave them a small cottage at the edge of the property, separate and private. 2 bedrooms, a real kitchen with a cast iron stove, glass windows that didn't leak, and a porch that looked out over the Powder River Basin all the way to the Bighorn Mountains. Ruth Wade cried the first time she walked through it. Not sad tears, but the kind that came from a burden finally being lifted. She ran her hands over the smooth planed wood of the kitchen table, tested the pump at the sink that brought water right into the house, stood in the bedroom that would be hers alone and just breathed. That night, Ethan heard her praying through the thin wall, thanking God for miracles and second chances and the kindness of broken men learning to be whole again. But it was the barn that became Ethan's true home. Clayton had given him free rein to convert the old stock barn into something new, something that honored Catherine's memory while serving a purpose she would have loved. They started by clearing out decades of accumulated equipment and debris, revealing the good bones underneath. Hand-hewn timber beams, solid stone foundation, a structure built to last generations. Hank Dawson appeared the second day of work, his few possessions loaded on a pack horse, and simply started helping without asking permission. Clayton found him there at sunset, saw the old man working alongside Ethan to repair a stall door, and the 2 men stood looking at each other for a long moment. All the years of bitterness and blame hung between them like smoke. "I owe you an apology," Clayton said finally, "for more than I can list, but mostly for taking my grief out on you when you were only trying to do right." "I owe you one too," Hank replied, his voice rough. "For not being honest with your wife when my gut told me something was wrong, for putting my own wants ahead of her safety. She wouldn't want us carrying this anymore, either of us." Clayton extended his hand. "Help me build something that matters. Help me make this place what she always wanted it to be." They shook, two old men trying to bury ghosts and build futures, and something fundamental shifted in the Wyoming air. The transformation of the barn took 6 weeks. They built 30 stalls, each one spacious and well ventilated. They ran water lines from the creek, installed feeding systems, created a medical bay with proper equipment ordered from Cheyenne. Clayton spared no expense, pouring money into the project with an urgency that spoke to years of guilt-seeking outlet. Grace worked alongside them, her fine dresses traded for practical work clothes, her soft hands developing calluses. She'd enrolled in a veterinary correspondence course, the first woman in Wyoming territory to do so, and she attacked the studies with ferocious determination. At night, she'd read aloud from the textbooks while Ethan cleaned tack and Hank repaired equipment, all of them learning together. The first rescue horse arrived in late October, brought by a rancher from the northern basin. It was a mare, maybe 15 years old, so severely foundered that walking was agony. The rancher had been about to shoot her when he'd heard about the new sanctuary. "Heard you folks might be able to help," he said, his hat in his hands. "She was a good horse once. Seems wrong to just end her without trying." Grace examined the mare with careful thoroughness, her textbook knowledge combining with natural instinct. "The founder's bad, rotation in both front hooves, but if we can manage the pain and adjust her diet, she might recover enough to have a comfortable life." They named her Sunset for the copper color of her coat, and she became their first project. Ethan applied everything he'd learned with Windchaser, the careful feeding, the patient rehabilitation, the constant, gentle reminders that humans could be kind. 3 months later, Sunset was walking without limping, grazing peacefully in the paddock, teaching them that Windchaser's recovery hadn't been a fluke. It could be repeated. It could become a system. Word spread the way it always did in ranching country. By spring of 1896, they were receiving requests from across 3 territories. Horses injured in work accidents, horses traumatized by abuse, horses simply too old to be profitable but too beloved to kill. They took them all, every one they had space for, and the barn that had once stored hay and equipment became a place of healing. But it was Windchaser who remained the heart of everything they built. His racing days were over. The tendon injury from the rodeo had healed, but it left him with a permanent limp, nothing severe but enough to prevent any competitive work. Yet somehow, impossibly, he'd found a new purpose. The children discovered it first. A young girl named Sarah, maybe 8 years old, had been brought to the ranch by her father. She'd witnessed her mother's death in a wagon accident 6 months prior and hadn't spoken since. Trauma had locked her voice away, and doctors offered no hope of recovery. Her father, desperate, had heard about the sanctuary and came asking if his daughter could spend time around the horses. "I don't know what I'm hoping for," he admitted, "but she loved horses before. Maybe being around them again might help." Ethan brought Sarah to Windchaser's paddock and introduced them. The girl looked at the horse with those huge, haunted eyes, and Windchaser looked back. Then, moving with careful deliberation, the horse walked to the fence and lowered his head, bringing himself down to her level. An invitation. Sarah reached through the fence rails and touched his muzzle. Her fingers traced the white star on his forehead, and something in her face changed. Not dramatically, but fractionally. A wall beginning to crack. She came every day for a month, never speaking but spending hours with Windchaser, grooming him under Ethan's supervision, learning to lead him around the paddock, sitting in his stall while he ate, just being present with him. The horse seemed to understand her silence, to respect it, to offer his own quiet companionship without demanding anything in return. On the 32nd day, Sarah was brushing Windchaser's mane when she began to hum, just a soft, tuneless sound. But her father, watching from the fence, grabbed Ethan's arm hard enough to bruise. It was the first sound she'd made in 6 months. 3 days later, she spoke her first words since her mother's death. She was braiding Windchaser's forelock, her small fingers working with careful concentration, when she whispered so quietly Ethan almost missed it. "Thank you for being my friend." Windchaser's ear swiveled back listening, and he made a soft rumbling sound in his chest. Acknowledgement, understanding, you're welcome. Sarah's father wept. Grace, who'd been observing from the barn, covered her mouth to stifle her own sobs, and Ethan understood something profound. Windchaser hadn't just survived his own trauma, he'd learned to help others survive theirs. Suffering had made him not bitter but compassionate. Broken had taught him how to heal. The pattern repeated over the following years. Traumatized children, veterans dealing with nightmares from range wars, widows and widowers carrying grief they couldn't speak. They'd come to the sanctuary, ostensibly to help with the horses, but really seeking help themselves. And Windchaser, the horse who'd been left to die in a back pasture, became their teacher. He'd stand patiently while trembling hands groomed him. He'd walk slowly beside people who needed to move but didn't know where to go. He'd rest his heavy head on shoulders that carried too much weight, offering his solid presence as a reminder that surviving was possible. That healing, however slow and imperfect, was real. Hank watched all of this with wonder that bordered on reverence. "He's doing what Catherine did," the old man said one evening as they watched Windchaser work with a young man who'd lost his arm in a ranch accident. "She had this gift of making people feel seen, feel valuable. This horse, he's carrying on her work." Clayton, who'd begun spending his evenings at the barn instead of alone in his big house, nodded slowly. "I tried to erase her memory by destroying what she loved, but you brought it back, and now it's bigger than it ever was when she was alive. She'd call that poetic justice." The relationship between Clayton and Grace transformed through the work. They'd been strangers living in the same house, connected by blood but separated by grief and guilt. Now they were partners in purpose. She'd show him techniques she'd learned from her veterinary studies. He'd share ranch management wisdom earned through 40 years of hard lessons. They'd argue, sometimes heatedly, about treatment protocols or expansion plans. But they were talking, connecting, becoming family again. One evening, after a particularly difficult day treating a horse with colic, Grace found her father sitting on the porch of the cottage he'd built near the barn. He'd moved out of the main house, preferring to be closer to the work, and Grace had followed. They shared the small space now, and the proximity forced communication that the mansion's many rooms had allowed them to avoid. "I've been thinking about your mother," Clayton said without preamble. "About how she'd spend hours out here with the horses while I was in town making deals, building the business, thinking I was building our future. But the future she wanted was right here, and I was too blind to see it." Grace sat beside him. "She loved you, you know, even when you frustrated her. She told me once that you had a good heart buried under all that ambition, that someday you'd find it again. Took me 2 years and a 17-year-old boy to dig it out." Clayton was quiet for a moment. "You look like her, every day more like her. Used to terrify me seeing her face in yours. Now it's the only thing that brings me comfort." "She'd be proud of this place," Grace said. "Of what we're building, of who you're becoming." "Maybe, or maybe she's been here all along working through that horse, making sure her dream didn't die with her." He looked at his daughter. "I'm proud of you, Gracie. Your mother would be too. You took my anger and her loss and you turned it into something beautiful. That takes strength I didn't know you had." Grace leaned her head on her father's shoulder, and they sat together in the gathering darkness, two people learning that love could survive grief if you gave it room to transform. The seasons turned. 1896 became 1897, then 1898. The Catherine Mercer Memorial Sanctuary grew from 30 stalls to 50, then 70. They established a training program for young people interested in equine care, providing education that had never existed in the territory before. Ranch families who couldn't afford veterinary care could bring their horses for treatment at reduced cost or in exchange for labor. Ethan, now 20, had grown into his role as head trainer with natural authority. He moved through the barn with quiet confidence, able to read horses and people with equal skill. He developed his own training methods, building on Hank's foundation but adapting to each animal's individual needs. Ranchers from Montana to Colorado sought his expertise, and he could have commanded premium wages anywhere. But he stayed, bound by something deeper than money. Ruth Wade's transformation was perhaps the quietest but most profound. Her hands, once red and swollen from washing other people's clothes, healed in the sanctuary's kitchen where she cooked for the staff and visiting families. She baked bread that became locally famous, ran the sanctuary's accounts with meticulous precision, and became the emotional center of the operation. People came to her with problems both equine and human, and she dispensed wisdom with the same practicality she applied to everything. Hank aged gracefully into his mid-70s, his expertise more valuable than ever. He could look at a lame horse and know immediately what was wrong, could assess an injured animal's chances with accuracy that bordered on supernatural. He'd become gentle with the years, the hard edges worn smooth by purpose and forgiveness. He still lived simply, in a small room attached to the barn, preferring the company of horses to the comfort of proper housing. It was Hank who noticed the change in Windchaser first. Subtle things. The horse moving a bit slower, standing in his stall more, grazing less. Nothing alarming, just the natural progression of age. Windchaser was pushing 30 now, ancient for a horse, and every day he woke up was a gift. "He's getting old," Hank said to Ethan one morning in the spring of 1902. "We need to prepare ourselves. He's lived a good life, a full life, but nothing lives forever." Ethan knew it was true, but the knowledge sat heavy in his chest. Windchaser had been the catalyst for everything. The sanctuary, the community they'd built, the person Ethan had become. The thought of losing him felt like contemplating the removal of a foundation stone. But Windchaser seemed content. He still worked with troubled visitors, still offered his patient presence to those who needed it. But his energy was finite now, carefully rationed. He'd spend mornings in the paddock, afternoons in his stall, evenings watching the sunset from his favorite spot near the creek. It was there, on a warm June evening in 1902, that Windchaser chose to make his final statement. Ethan found him lying down, which wasn't unusual, but something in the horse's posture made him approach with concern. Windchaser's breathing was slow and steady, his eye clear, but there was a quality to his stillness that felt deliberate, peaceful, final. "Hey, old friend," Ethan said, settling onto the ground beside the horse's head. "You feeling all right?" Windchaser's eye tracked to him, and in that brown gaze was something that looked like gratitude, like satisfaction, like a job completed. Ethan called for the others. Hank came first, took one look and nodded with understanding. Grace arrived next, her medical bag in hand, but after examining Windchaser she set it aside. There was nothing wrong that medicine could fix. This was simply a body that had carried a great spirit for 30 years, now ready to rest. Clayton came, and Ruth, and many of the sanctuary's staff. They gathered in a loose circle around the horse, honoring him with their presence. Sarah, the girl who'd found her voice again, now 14 and working at the sanctuary every summer, sat cross-legged by Windchaser's side, her hand on his neck. "He saved me," she said simply. "When I couldn't talk, he listened. When I couldn't feel anything, he made me feel safe. He's the best friend I ever had." The sun moved across the sky, painting the world in shades of amber and gold. Windchaser's breathing gradually slowed, each breath a little shallower than the last. There was no struggle, no distress, just a gentle releasing, like a sailor finally reaching harbor after a long voyage. As the sun touched the horizon, Windchaser opened his eye one more time. He looked at each person gathered around him, as if taking inventory, making sure everyone he loved was accounted for. His gaze lingered longest on Ethan, and some communication passed between them that needed no words. "Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible. Thank you for believing when everyone else laughed. Thank you for giving me purpose when I thought I had none left." Then Windchaser closed his eye, took one final deep breath, and released it slowly. The exhalation seemed to carry his spirit with it, rising into the evening air, becoming part of the wind that swept across the Powder River basin. He was gone. The silence that followed was profound, not the silence of shock or grief, but something deeper, the silence of reverence, of witnessing something sacred. Hank spoke first, his voice thick with tears. "Catherine, your boy's coming home. You take care of him now. He's earned his rest." They buried Windchaser on the hill overlooking the sanctuary, in a spot where he'd love to stand and watch the sunset. The entire community came to pay respects. Ranchers who'd scorned the sanctuary initially, families who'd brought horses for healing, children who'd found comfort in his patient presence. They stood together in the summer heat and told stories of what this horse had meant to them. Clayton was the last to speak. He stood at the grave with his hand on Grace's shoulder, looking at the mound of fresh earth, and his voice carried clearly in the still air. "I tried to kill this horse because I couldn't face my own pain. I starved him and abandoned him and hoped he would quietly disappear. But Ethan Wade saw something I'd forgotten to look for. He saw worth where I saw only problems, possibility where I saw only the past." He paused, gathering himself. "Windchaser didn't just survive what I did to him, he transformed it. He took suffering and made it into wisdom, took pain and made it into compassion, took brokenness and made it into a mission to heal others. He was, in every way that matters, a better being than I am, than most of us are." Clayton's voice cracked, but he showed us what we could be, showed us that the worst thing that happens to you doesn't have to define you. That second chances are real if you're brave enough to take them. That love, even when it seems to end, can echo forward in ways you never imagined. They erected a marker over the grave, simple but permanent, a stone carved with words that Grace had chosen. WNDCHSER, 1872 to 1902. Champion, teacher, friend. He showed us that broken things can heal, and that the courage to try again is the greatest victory of all. In memory of Catherine Mercer, who believed in second chances. The weeks after Windchaser's death were difficult. The sanctuary felt emptier, as if a light had gone out. But the work continued because that's what Windchaser had taught them. You keep going. You honor loss by living fully. And something unexpected began to happen. People started bringing horses specifically because they'd heard Windchaser's story. Not for treatment, but to be part of something that mattered. The sanctuary's mission expanded. They started rescuing horses from slaughter auctions, taking in wild mustangs from government roundups, partnering with other ranches to establish humane treatment standards. By 1905, the Catherine Mercer Memorial Sanctuary had become the largest horse rescue operation in the Rocky Mountain region. They'd saved over 300 animals from death or suffering. They'd trained 24 young people in equine care. They'd created a model that other sanctuaries across the West began to replicate. Ethan, now 24, had married quietly. Not Grace, as some had speculated, but a schoolteacher named Elizabeth from Buffalo who'd grown up hearing the story of the boy and the broken horse. They had their first child in 1906, a daughter they named Catherine, and she grew up running through the sanctuary barn, fearless around horses, continuing a legacy. Grace never married. She'd found her calling in veterinary medicine and eventually became the first licensed female veterinarian in Wyoming territory, an achievement that made newspapers from Denver to San Francisco. She lived in the cottage with her father until his death in 1910, and afterward she kept living there, preferring its simplicity to the empty mansion. Clayton Mercer's transformation in his final years became the stuff of local legend. The man who'd once ruled through fear and money became known for generosity and humility. He'd established a fund to help struggling ranch families, anonymously paying medical bills and school fees. When he died at 69, his funeral was attended by over 1,000 people, many of whom had once feared him, all of whom had learned to respect the man he'd become. Hank Dawson lived to 89, working at the sanctuary until the final month of his life. He'd pass away quietly in his sleep in that small room attached to the barn, surrounded by the sounds of horses moving in their stalls. They buried him next to Windchaser, per his request, with a marker that read simply, "He kept his promise." Ruth Wade saw her 80th birthday, surrounded by grandchildren and great-grandchildren, her hands finally soft from years of gentle work instead of hard labor. She'd lived to see her son become a man of respect and influence, to see the sanctuary touch thousands of lives, to see suffering transformed into purpose. The years rolled on. 1910 became 1920, then 1925. The Catherine Mercer Memorial Sanctuary grew into a network of 6 facilities across Wyoming and Montana. The techniques developed there, the philosophy of patient rehabilitation and compassionate care, spread throughout the American West. Thousands of horses owed their lives to methods pioneered in that converted barn. But it all traced back to one moment, to a day when a cruel man thought he was delivering a humiliation and accidentally delivered a miracle, to a boy who looked at a dying horse and saw a possibility, to an old man who found redemption in teaching, to a young woman who honored her mother by helping the creature her mother loved. Ethan, now 65 years old, stood on the hill overlooking the sanctuary on a June evening in 1944. The world had changed dramatically since that August day in 1895 when Clayton Mercer had handed him a frayed rope and a broken horse. Automobiles had replaced horses on most roads. 2 world wars had reshaped nations. Wyoming had achieved statehood. But this place, this sanctuary, it remained, still healing, still offering second chances, still proving every single day that broken things could be made whole. A young boy approached, maybe 10 years old, leading a starved mare that had been seized from an abusive situation. The mare was terrified, emaciated, resistant to trust. The boy looked overwhelmed. "Mr. Wade," the voice was small, uncertain. "Can she be saved? Everyone says she's too far gone, that we should just put her down." Ethan looked at the mare, saw the ribs showing, the dull coat, the fearful eyes, saw echoes of Windchaser in every line of her suffering body. He smiled and rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Son, let me tell you a story about a horse named Windchaser, about how the most broken things can become the most beautiful, about how the ones everyone gives up on are often the ones with the most to teach us, about how courage isn't being unafraid, it's being terrified and trying anyway." They walked toward the barn together, man and boy and frightened horse, and behind them the sun set over the Powder River Basin, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold. And on the hill, the grave marker caught the last light of day, the words still clear after 42 years. Broken things can heal, courage is trying again, second chances are real. The greatest truths Ethan had learned were the simplest ones, and the best way to honor those who came before was to keep their work alive, to keep believing, to keep trying, to keep seeing value where others saw only problems. To look at the broken and see not endings, but beginnings. The barn door closed behind them, and in the gathering darkness, if you listened very carefully, you could almost hear it. The soft nicker of a horse who'd learned what it meant to be loved. The echo of hoofbeats that had carried hope across 9 weeks of impossible work. The whisper of a legacy that would outlive them all. Windchaser was gone, but Windchaser was everywhere. In every horse they saved, in every person they helped heal, in every moment they chose compassion over cruelty, hope over despair, purpose over profit. The last honest horse had taught them all how to be honest with themselves, how to face their brokenness and transform it, how to take the worst thing that ever happened and make it into the catalyst for the best thing they'd ever do. And that lesson, passed from generation to generation, from heart to heart, from one broken thing to another learning to be whole, that lesson would never die. The stars came out over Wyoming, brilliant and eternal, and somewhere in that vastness a horse was running. No limp, no pain, no fear, just pure joyful movement. Running not from anything but toward everything. Home at last, free at last, remembered forever.